There's a moment most mornings that you never quite catch. It happens somewhere between the last second of sleep and the first second of being awake, and it lasts about half a heartbeat. In that half a heartbeat, you are still inside the world you were dreaming, and you are also somehow in this one. The dream hasn't ended yet. The room hasn't quite started. You're lying in the dark or in the grey light of whatever hour it is, and for that small interval, you genuinely do not know which of the two worlds you belong to. Then the real room arrives, the ceiling, the weight of the blanket, the sound of the street, and the dream recedes so quickly that within a few seconds you can't remember most of what was in it. But the feeling of it is still there. And the feeling of the dream, for a few more seconds, is almost indistinguishable from the feeling of the morning. You have this moment most days. You don't think about it. It doesn't survive coffee, but it's been with you since you were a child, and it will be with you when you are very old. And if you pay close attention to it, just once, you'll notice something strange. In that half a heartbeat, you had no way of telling which side you were on. You weren't confused. You were simply in a state where the question of real and not real hadn't yet been decided for you. A few seconds later, the decision got made by default, the way most decisions do, and you forgot that for a moment it was open. This is a small thing. You have thousands of small things every day, but under this particular small thing, there is a question so old that a Chinese philosopher sat with it in the 4th century BC. And a French soldier sat with it in a stove-heated room in the winter of 1619, and a philosopher at Oxford sat with it in 2003 and worked out, using probability theory, that it was much stranger than anyone had realized. The question does not seem to get any easier as the centuries accumulate. It only gets stranger. The question, stripped of its various accents, is this: how would you know right now whether what you're experiencing is real? Not real in some academic sense, real in the sense that matters to you, real in the way the weight of the blanket is real, or the warmth of the pillow, or the fact of the person who may or may not be sleeping next to you. Suppose, and you can hold this very lightly as a thought, not a claim, suppose that none of it was. Suppose the whole room and you in it, and the street outside, and the stars beyond the street were being produced somewhere else, in some way you have no access to, for some reason you don't know. Suppose this with enough care and the suggestion doesn't go anywhere. You can't disprove it. You also can't quite believe it. It sits, the way the half-second sits, in a place where no decision has been made yet. In the 4th century BC, a man called Zhuangzi fell asleep and dreamed that he was a butterfly. When he woke, he was Zhuangzi again, and solid and certain of himself, and then a second later, he was not so certain. The question he asked, and it is almost the first recorded version of the question we're sitting with, was the one that arrives, for most of us, every morning, and goes unnoticed. He just happened to notice. Before we go any further, a small favor. If what you're listening to feels worth being made, the subscribe button helps a channel like this more than almost anything else. And there's one thing I'd like to know in the comments. When you wake up tomorrow, and it'll happen most likely whether or not you remember I asked, see if you can catch that half second. Most people can't. Some people can. I'd like to know which group you fall into. Now, if you're comfortable, get a little more comfortable. The lamp nearest you is probably brighter than it needs to be. The shoulders can unclench. This is the kind of question that becomes more available when the day's defenses are down, which is why, if you're lying in the dark tonight, you'll hear it differently than you would at noon. And since the question is older than any of us, we should begin where it first took the shape we'd recognize, not in a philosophy seminar, in a dream. Somewhere in China, about 2,500 years ago, it's the era we now call the Warring States. The country that will one day be China is not one country yet. It's 7 kingdoms that have been killing each other, off and on, for about 2 centuries. Armies are enormous. Generals are paid to think of new ways to destroy walled cities. Most villages have lost their young men more than once, and in a small town in the Song State, a minor official, by some accounts a lacquer tree supervisor, is writing down a story about falling asleep. His name, the way we spell it now in English, is Zhuangzi, pronounced roughly Zhuangzi. He was born around 369 BC, and by the time he writes the story that will outlive every empire of his century, he is middle-aged and has already refused at least one offer to become a high minister, reportedly on the grounds that he would rather drag his tail in the mud like a free turtle than be worshipped as a dead one in a royal temple. This is the kind of man he is. He writes the way he lives, sideways, unwilling to be useful, funnier than he ought to be. And one day, in a chapter that will be called, later, The Adjustment of Controversies, he writes the following. I'm going to give it to you plainly, the way Burton Watson translated it into English in the 1960s, because there's something about the flatness of Watson's prose that lets the strangeness of the story come through. Once, Zhuangzi dreamt he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzi. Suddenly, he woke up and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzi. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi who had dreamt he was a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzi. Between Zhuangzi and the butterfly, there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. That's the whole thing. 110 words in the Chinese. It stops there. There's no argument, no moral, no next paragraph explaining what Zhuangzi meant. He just writes it down and moves on, the way you might note down a dream in a notebook. For about 2,500 years, people have been trying to work out what he meant. The most common Western reading, and this is the one you probably absorbed at some point without anyone handing it to you directly, is that Zhuangzi is an ancient skeptic. He's saying, we can't tell dream from waking, and therefore we can't be sure what's real. He's Descartes before Descartes. He's the simulation hypothesis in silk robes. This reading is so widespread that when Western philosophers cite the passage, they often cite it as a precursor to the arguments we'll be looking at for the next 2 hours. The trouble is, Zhuangzi doesn't seem to be making that argument. The clue is in the last line. This is called the transformation of things. In Chinese, wuhua, 2 characters, literally things changing. It's the name Zhuangzi gives to the whole experience, and it's a very specific name. He's not pointing at an uncertainty, he's pointing at a movement. Something moved in the night. Something that was Zhuangzi became something that was a butterfly, and then something that was a butterfly became, again, something that we call Zhuangzi. There's a distinction between the two, Zhuangzi says, and then he stops because the distinction is not what interests him. What interests him is the fact that it can slide. Brook Ziporyn, whose 2009 translation of the Zhuangzi is probably the one a serious reader would turn to today, translates that last line slightly differently. He renders it as the transformation of one thing into another, which is closer to what Zhuangzi seems to be doing. He's not saying the dream was real and the waking might also be a dream. He's saying, whatever you currently feel so certain is you, this stable self, this particular shape, this Zhuangzi, has just proven, in the space of a single night's sleep, that it can become something else entirely, fully, without remainder, and the something else felt just as solid while it lasted. This is a very different claim, and it lands in a different place. Robert Allison, who spent much of his career on this passage, put it this way in a book from 1989. The butterfly dream is not a puzzle about which state is real. It's an analogy for a change in the quality of a person's consciousness, a movement from one way of being to another, with the old one looking strange from the vantage of the new. It's not skepticism. It's closer to an account of what it feels like to wake up, in the ordinary sense, but also in the other sense, the sense that every meditative tradition has some version of, and so we have already a fork in the road. You can read Zhuangzi as asking the question that will become the simulation question. How do I know that what I'm experiencing is real? Or you can read him as asking something that looks similar but isn't. Who is the one experiencing it, and is that one as solid as I keep assuming? These are not the same question. They feel like they might be because they both involve dreams and both involve the possibility that things are not as they seem. But the first question has answers, in principle. Someone might one day prove or disprove the simulation hypothesis. The second question doesn't. The second question is something you can live inside of for a lifetime, and the longer you live inside it, the more it changes shape, which may be why the people who have spent the most time with it, meditators, mystics, a certain kind of poet, don't tend to answer it. They tend to report back on how it behaves. Something else worth noticing. Zhuangzi writes the story in the third person. He doesn't say I dreamt I was a butterfly. He says Zhuangzi dreamt he was a butterfly. The dreamer and the writer are not quite the same person. The writer is looking at the dreamer from the outside, reporting on him the way you might report on someone else's strange night. Which, if you've ever tried to write down one of your own dreams the morning after, you'll recognize. The you who is writing is not the you who was dreaming. There was a distinction. But it's very hard to say where exactly the distinction was, or when exactly the one became the other. That is also the transformation of things. The butterfly dream, then, is older than the question we think it's asking, and possibly asking a different question altogether. It's asking, among other things, how it is that something as apparently solid as you can come undone in the span of a single night, convincingly enough that the undoing feels like home. And it's noticing, this is the part most easily missed, that the question of what was real is somehow less pressing once you've seen that. You get closest to what Zhuangzi may have been pointing at when you catch it yourself, not in the dream, which is gone by the time you're awake enough to think about it, in the half-minute after, when the dream self hasn't finished dissolving and the waking self hasn't finished assembling, and there's a brief overlap in which you can feel both or neither, and neither feels entirely convincing. That overlap is very hard to hold for long. It tends to collapse into the daytime shape of a person almost as soon as you notice it. But while it lasts, it is, in a small domestic way, the transformation of things. Which means that the question, the one we've been trying to work out whether Zhuangzi is asking, is not, in the end, a question you can answer. You can only catch it, from time to time, in its own habitat, which happens to be where you are, just about now, and where you will be again, in a few hours, when the day has finished subtracting itself. There is, as it happens, another version of this story. It's about 700 years later in a book by a Greek philosopher who has never heard of Zhuangzi. In that version, there are no butterflies. There is a cave. There are prisoners. And the question that Plato asks when he writes it down is going to sound familiar. But again, it won't be quite the question we expect it to be. Here is a question that usually doesn't survive being asked directly, so I'll ask it carefully. If someone you loved had spent their entire life believing something comforting but false, and you knew the truth, and the truth was uglier, and the uglier truth would never give them back the quality of the life they had, would you tell them? If you're quick to say yes, you're in the majority, but it's worth lingering on because the whole force of the story I'm about to tell you lives inside the hesitation some people feel when they try to answer it honestly. Plato felt that hesitation, and he built the most famous picture in Western philosophy around it. The picture is about 2,400 years old by now. It sits at the start of the 7th book of a long dialogue we call the Republic, which Plato wrote somewhere around 375 BC, not long after his teacher Socrates had been executed by the city of Athens on charges that were, by any honest reading, political. That matters. The man writing this picture has just watched his teacher be killed for telling a city truths it didn't want to hear. When he sits down to describe what education is and what it costs, he is not in an abstract mood. The picture itself is easy to visualize. Imagine, Socrates says to his interlocutor Glaucon, a long cave with an entrance somewhere far behind you. The cave opens out to the sun, but you have never seen the opening because you have been chained by the neck and ankles since childhood in such a way that you can only look forward at one wall. Behind you there's a fire. Between the fire and the wall of your neck chains, there's a raised walkway. And on the walkway there are people carrying objects, statues of animals, shapes of things, puppets, holding them up so that the fire casts their shadows on the wall you face. Some of the people behind you are talking. The sounds echo off the wall and come back to you as if the shadows themselves were speaking. Now, you have been there since you were a child. Everyone you have ever known has been there since they were children. Nobody has ever explained the situation to you because nobody who would explain it knows about the situation either. As far as you are concerned, the shadows on the wall are everything. They are the world. You and the other prisoners have become very skilled at reading them. You can predict which shape will follow which. You can name them. You compete over who can name them fastest. That is what you take intelligence to be. Suppose, and this is Socrates' word suppose, which is worth noticing because it means he knows he's describing something that won't happen on its own. Suppose that one of the prisoners is somehow freed, not gently. The Greek verb is closer to dragged. Someone drags this prisoner up, turns him around to face the fire, and then, against his will, up the rough path out of the cave and into the sunlight. The freed prisoner's eyes have never seen fire directly, let alone the sun. For a long time he is effectively blind. He can only look at shadows on the ground because they're the only things that resemble what he used to see. Eventually he learns to look at reflections in water, then at things themselves, then at the sky at night, and finally, this takes a while, he can look at the sun. And now comes the part of the story that almost no popular summary includes, and which is, I think, the heart of it. He goes back. He doesn't stay in the sunlight. He climbs back down into the cave and tries to tell his old companions what he has seen. And of course, his eyes, now adjusted to the sun, can no longer see in the dark the way they used to. He stumbles. He loses his old skill with the shadows. The other prisoners watch him and conclude that whatever he went up to see has ruined him, that the journey out of the cave is a journey into stupidity. And if, Socrates says, the other prisoners could lay their hands on the person who dragged him out of the cave in the first place, they would kill him now. If you've absorbed the cave story from the usual places, a college intro class, a line in a film, the ambient culture, what you've probably absorbed is the first part. Shadows on the wall aren't the real thing. The real things are outside, in the sun. This is more or less how the cave gets taught as a picture of the simulation hypothesis. The shadows are the virtual reality. The sun is the base reality. Get out of the cave. Find the truth. But Plato, who doesn't often tell us what his allegories mean, tells us this time. He puts it in Socrates' mouth a few lines later. The allegory is about, and I'm quoting, the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature. Not about virtual reality, not about computers obviously, but also not about the general question of whether what we experience is fake. About education, specifically about what happens to a person who sees something most people will never see and then has to live among people who will never see it for the rest of his life, which is an entirely different story, and it lands in an entirely different place. Because notice what the cave allegory actually says. It doesn't say, find out whether the world is real. It doesn't even say, try to get out of the cave. It says something much more uncomfortable. It says that the few who do get out, not by their own efforts, Plato is clear, but because someone drags them, will find themselves at the end of it all climbing back down, and the climbing back down will not be rewarded, it will be punished. The prisoners will not thank the returning philosopher, they will not even listen to him, they will, if they can, kill him. Plato is not asking us whether reality is what we think it is. He is asking us something sharper. Suppose, he says, that it isn't. Suppose that what most people take for the world is in fact a small part of the world, lit unreliably, arranged by forces they can't see. Suppose that a very small number of people, for reasons that are mostly accidental, come to notice this. What is the obligation of those people? Do they climb back down? Do they stay in the sun? And if they climb back down, knowing perfectly well what they'll meet, what exactly is the point of having gone up in the first place? These are not questions the simulation hypothesis even knows how to ask. The simulation hypothesis is a probabilistic claim about the substrate of reality. Plato's cave is a political and ethical problem about what to do with knowledge that isolates you. They are not the same problem, and to read Plato as a proto-simulation theorist is to miss almost everything that was on his mind. His teacher had just been killed for knowing things the city didn't want known. He is writing in part about whether a person in that situation should have kept quieter. There's a thread here that leads somewhere unexpected. The classicist Melissa Lane, who has spent a great deal of her working life inside the Republic, has pointed out that the cave is not a one-way story. The freed prisoner doesn't simply learn the truth and transcend the illusion. He does something stranger. He goes up, he looks, he comes back, he sees the shadows again. But now he sees them as shadows. The world hasn't changed. His relationship to it has. The light has become visible somehow inside the dark. This is a very different thing from waking up from a simulation. It is closer to what happens when you understand, for the first time as an adult, something that your parents have always known but could never quite explain to you. The facts of your childhood don't change, but their shape now is different. You are still in the same cave. You are just, for the first time, aware that it is one. Which is also possibly what most of us are doing most of the time. You are listening to this in the dark, in a room whose exact dimensions you have stopped noticing years ago. There is a lamp on somewhere, probably too bright for the hour. The ceiling is a ceiling you see every night, which is to say, you don't see it. Your attention has narrowed down to the small pool of things that your particular life rewards you for attending to, and everything outside that pool has quietly become invisible. This is not bad. This is how people stay alive. But it is also, and Plato is very clear about this, the condition of someone for whom the shadows on the wall have become once again the whole world. The question the cave actually leaves us with then is not, is the world real? The question is something smaller and closer to the bone. It is, what are you currently not seeing? Because you have been rewarded for most of your life for not seeing it. And if something were to show you, not gently, what would it cost you to go back down and try to explain it to the people you love? That question is a private one. You don't have to answer it out loud. And yet, as Plato was dying in 347 BC and the Republic was being copied by hand across the ancient world, a line of thinkers was beginning to form. Greek, then Roman, then medieval, then Arabic, then European again, who would keep the cave in the back of their minds without ever quite resolving it. One of them, almost 2,000 years later, is going to find himself alone in a small room in the middle of a German winter, with a fire burning and nothing to do but think. He will not have read Zhuangzi, he will have read Plato, and he is going to do something that no one before him in the Western tradition has quite had the nerve to do. He is going to start from the beginning. You are 23 years old. It is the 10th of November, 1619, and you have been billeted for the winter in a small town on the Danube, somewhere near Ulm, in what is now southern Germany, but was then part of the Holy Roman Empire. You are not a local, you are a French gentleman soldier, loosely attached to the Catholic army of the Duke of Bavaria, and you have not seen combat and probably never will. The war you are technically part of is the one history will later call the 30 Years' War, though nobody knows yet that it will last that long. For the moment, it is cold and the army has gone into winter quarters and you have a room to yourself. The room has a stove. In the French of the time, the word poêle refers both to the stove itself and to the kind of small sealed chamber that a stove like this would heat to a temperature most of us would find oppressive. You have closed the door, you have been inside for several days. There is no one to talk to, no duty to attend to, and the weather outside is bad enough that you have not much considered leaving. This, as it happens, suits you. You have been thinking for some time about whether the various things you believe about the world are actually connected to each other in any orderly way, or whether you simply accumulated them, the way most people do from whatever sources were nearby when you were young. You have noticed that mathematics seems to be the exception. In mathematics, things fit. One proof leads cleanly into the next. And you have been wondering in a restless and not very disciplined way whether it might be possible to do something similar with the rest of knowledge. On the evening of the 10th, you go to bed earlier than usual. You have 3 dreams. The first one is violent. A strong wind pushes you sideways as you walk through an unfamiliar street, and you have to lean against it to keep from falling, and your right side feels weak and won't hold you up. You try to reach a church, but the wind keeps spinning you around, and at some point phantoms appear around you. You wake up, frightened. The second dream is shorter. There's a loud noise. You take it, in the dream, to be thunder. And when you open your eyes, still lying in the bed, you see sparks of fire scattered around the room. You stare at them for a while. Then you remember that you have seen this sort of thing before when half awake, and you decide it's nothing unusual, and you go back to sleep. The third dream is the one you will remember longest, and the one your first biographer will write down most carefully when he reconstructs this night, 71 years after you've died. You are sitting at a desk. There are 2 books on the desk. One is a dictionary, the other is a collection of poems. You open the poems at random and read the first line your eye lands on. In Latin, it says, "Quod vitae sectabor iter," which translates, roughly, as "What path in life shall I take?" A stranger appears and recommends a different poem. You reach for it, but the book has disappeared. When you turn back, the stranger is gone too, and the dream is ending, and you are already, while still inside it, beginning to interpret it. You will take these 3 dreams, the next morning, as a divine message. You will understand them to mean that you have been given a life's work, which is to find a single method, one method, by which all of human knowledge can be made to fit together the way mathematics fits together. You will, in Thanksgiving, make a pilgrimage to a Catholic shrine in Italy, and you will spend the next 22 years working out what this method is. All of that is recorded. The dreams, the pilgrimage, the ambition. What is not recorded, or rather, what has been lost, is the account you wrote yourself. Your notebook describing that night, a text now called Olympica, existed for a while after your death and was seen by at least one biographer. Then it disappeared. Everything we know about the 3 dreams we know because Adrien Baillet, a French priest writing your life story in the 1690s, had access to Olympica and summarized it for us before it vanished, which means that what we have when we have Descartes' dream is a 17th century priest's account of a dead philosopher's own account of his own dream, written more than 70 years after the fact. The image is legible, but it has passed through several hands. By 1641, the method that began on that winter night has become a book. It is called Meditations on First Philosophy, and it is one of the strangest books in Western philosophy because it doesn't read like philosophy. It reads like a man talking to himself. He is alone in a room. He has nothing to do for 6 days, and he is going to try, in those 6 days, to doubt every single thing he believes, to see if anything at all is left standing at the end. On the first day, he doubts the senses, because the senses have deceived him before. On the second, he goes further. Maybe he is dreaming right now, and the whole apparent world is a dream. But even dreams, he notices, are made of pieces borrowed from something. The shapes are real, even if their arrangement isn't. So he goes further still. Suppose, he says, that there is an evil demon, un mauvais génie, of enormous power and cunning whose only task is to deceive me. Suppose this demon has created the whole of the apparent world in my mind, the sky, the earth, my hands, my body, the fire in the grate, all of it a lie meant to trap my judgment. Everything I think I'm seeing is false. Everything I think I'm feeling is false. I don't even have eyes. At which point, something unusual happens. Descartes notices that there is one thing the evil demon cannot do. The demon can make me wrong about everything I perceive, but the demon cannot make me wrong about the fact that there is a me to be wrong. If I am being deceived, I must exist in order to be deceived. The deception needs a target. And so, in the middle of the most radical doubt anyone had attempted in 1500 years, Descartes arrives at the one sentence almost everyone knows, even people who have never read a word of him. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's worth saying, though, that this move is not quite as new as his reputation suggests. More than 1,000 years earlier, Augustine of Hippo, a North African bishop writing in the 4th century AD, grappling with the skepticism of his own day, had come to almost exactly the same conclusion. He wrote, in Latin, si enim falla sum. If I am deceived, I exist. The thought is old. What's new with Descartes is the use he tries to put it to, because Descartes thinks he has found a foundation. From the certainty of his own existence, he tries, in the remaining meditations, to rebuild the rest of the world. He argues his way to the existence of God, and from there to the reliability of his own faculties, and from there to the real existence of physical objects. It is a beautiful structure. It is also, most philosophers now agree, a structure that doesn't hold. The argument for God is circular. The argument for the external world depends on the argument for God. And so what looked at first like a foundation for all future knowledge turned out to rescue only one thing, the bare fact of the thinker. Which is why the evil demon has outlived the proofs that were supposed to put him to rest. Descartes introduced the demon as a device, a temporary worst case he was going to dispel by the end of the book. But the demon refused to leave. 400 years later, philosophers are still wrestling with him, and he has taken new forms: a scientist with a brain in a vat, a computer running an ancestor simulation, a civilization more advanced than ours playing a game with the substrate of reality. The costumes change. The demon stays. And here is something worth sitting with. Descartes ended his first meditation in what he thought was the deepest possible doubt. He thought the evil demon was the bottom, but the demon, as Descartes described him, is just a more powerful deceiver than an ordinary one. What if the doubt doesn't bottom out there? What if, beneath the demon, there is another question? Not, is someone deceiving me, but what would it even mean for my experience to be undeceived? At that point, the demon starts to feel less like a worst case and more like a placeholder, the best Descartes could manage in 1641. For a kind of doubt the vocabulary of his century wasn't quite equipped to name. This is not a criticism of him. He was trying to stop the doubt. He was trying to get to solid ground. What he didn't quite see, and maybe couldn't have seen, from inside a worldview that took consciousness for granted, is that the demon's real power wasn't deception. The demon's real power was raising a question that can't be answered from inside the head of the person asking it. You cannot, from where you are, check the world against the world. You can only check it against itself, which is why, for all the architecture of the meditations, the demon is still standing at the end. Quieter, maybe, politer, but still there. And every thinker who will come along after Descartes, and who will take the question seriously, will find him waiting. One of them is going to pick up the demon 362 years after 1641 and fit him with a new set of clothes, entirely made of probability theory, computer science, and a set of assumptions about what a sufficiently advanced civilization might do with enough computing power. The demon's face, underneath, will be exactly the one Descartes described. What will be different is that, this time, the argument for taking the demon seriously will not be a thought experiment. It will be a calculation. The question is short enough to fit on a postcard, and almost everyone has heard some version of it by now, but it's worth putting down in the form it took when a Swedish philosopher at Oxford wrote it into a journal article 23 years ago. The title of the article was, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" It was published in April of 2003 in a journal called the Philosophical Quarterly, which is not a journal anyone outside academic philosophy reads. Within a few weeks, newspapers on 3 continents had run stories about it. Within a few years, the question had become a minor cultural fixation, and within a decade, a billionaire on a stage in California was telling an audience that the probability we were in a simulation was, by his calculation, somewhere around 1,000,000,000 to 1. That is, certain. That billionaire was not Nick Bostrom, the author of the 2003 paper. Bostrom himself, when asked directly in interviews over the years, has never given his own simulation credence a number higher than about 1 in 5, which is worth noticing because the popular version of his argument and the argument he actually made are not the same thing. The popular version says, "We are almost certainly in a simulation." The argument he actually made says, "One of 3 very specific possibilities must be true, and we don't know which." The difference matters, because it's the difference between a prediction and a disjunction, and a disjunction is a much stranger animal. Here is the argument as Bostrom gave it. Suppose, and this is where the reasoning begins, with a supposition about the future rather than a claim about the present. Suppose that a civilization much more technologically advanced than ours eventually develops the ability to run computer simulations in which the simulated beings are themselves conscious, not cartoons, not characters, actual minds, running on a different substrate the way a piece of software runs on whatever chip happens to be underneath it. The assumption this requires, philosophers call it substrate independence, which simply means that consciousness doesn't care whether it's running on neurons or silicon or something more exotic, so long as the computation is right, is a large assumption. Not all philosophers accept it, but it's held by enough of them that it's a live position, and for the sake of the argument we grant it. Now suppose further that this advanced civilization, whoever they are, decides to use their enormous computing power to run simulations of their own distant past. What Bostrom calls ancestor simulations. Historical recreations, entire populations of simulated people living entire simulated lives for whatever reason a future civilization might have for doing such a thing. Research, entertainment, nostalgia, it doesn't matter. The question is just whether they would, and whether, if they did, they could make them detailed enough that the simulated people inside could not tell. If all of that happens, if civilizations like this exist and run ancestor simulations at scale, then somewhere out in the universe, at any given time, there are an enormous number of simulated minds, vastly more simulated minds than original biological ones, so many more that if you pick a mind at random from the total population of all minds, original and simulated combined, it is overwhelmingly likely to be a simulated one. That ratio, the ratio of fake minds to real ones, becomes, in Bostrom's argument, what he calls the fraction of all people who are sims. And now, the move that makes the argument what it is. You, listening to this, are a mind. You have to be one of the minds in that total population. You have no way of knowing, from the inside, whether you are one of the original biological ones or one of the simulated ones. If the ratio is what the argument suggests it is, if simulated minds overwhelmingly outnumber real ones, then the rational thing for you to believe, without any further information, is that you are almost certainly simulated. This is where most people, at least when they first hear the argument, feel a quiet sinking in the chest and are not quite sure what to do with it. But the argument doesn't actually end there. Bostrom's paper takes one more turn, and the turn is the whole point. Because the reasoning above depends on that supposition we started with, that advanced civilizations develop ancestor simulation technology and use it. If that supposition is true, we're probably simulated. So what if it's not true? Bostrom breaks the possibility space into three. At least one of the following, he says, must be the case. Either 1. No civilization like ours ever survives long enough to develop that kind of computing power. We kill ourselves off first, or we stop being curious, or something terrible happens to every species that ever gets this far. The stars are full of civilizations that almost made it. Or 2. Civilizations do survive and do develop the technology, but for some reason, ethical or practical or simply temperamental, they never choose to run ancestor simulations. Maybe it's considered obscene, maybe it's illegal, maybe they find it boring. Whatever the reason, the simulations don't get made. Or 3. The simulations do get made, at scale, and we are almost certainly in one. One of those three must be true. Bostrom isn't telling you which. The paper doesn't make a prediction. It makes a menu, and the menu has 3 items on it, and you have to pick. What makes the argument harder than it first sounds is that the 3 items on the menu are not equally easy to swallow. The first one requires believing that the road ahead for any civilization ends badly. That extinction or stagnation is the default, that no one breaks through. The second requires believing that civilizations with godlike computing power, for reasons nobody can quite specify, refuse to use it to recreate their own past. The third requires believing that you, sitting wherever you are, listening to whatever you're listening to, are not what you think you are. None of these beliefs is comfortable, and the argument, unusually for philosophy, insists that the discomfort of one of them is unavoidable. It did not take long for the argument to come under attack. The sharpest early objection came from an Australian philosopher named Brian Weatherson, who published a paper in the Philosophical Quarterly the same year titled simply, "Are You a Sim?" Weatherson went after the step in the argument where Bostrom moves from "there are many more simulated minds than real ones" to "therefore you are probably a simulated one." That move relies on a principle Bostrom calls the bland indifference principle, which says, roughly, if you have no information about which mind in a group you are, you should treat yourself as equally likely to be any of them. Weatherson's objection, stripped of its technicalities, is that this principle doesn't quite do the work Bostrom needs it to do, because you do in fact have information about yourself. Specifically, you have the particular experiences of being the particular person you are, and that information changes what you should believe. Bostrom replied the following year in the same journal, and the exchange went back and forth for a while. Neither philosopher exactly won. Most of the subsequent literature has looked like that. The simulation argument has not been refuted. It has also not been proven. It sits, 23 years on, in the condition philosophical arguments often end up in, technically unresolved, quietly influential, cited by people who mean slightly different things by it, and not quite settled. And Bostrom himself, the person who wrote the paper, the person you might expect to have the strongest view, has been consistent in a way that is easy to miss. On podcasts and in lectures, when asked whether he thinks we are in a simulation, he doesn't say yes. He says the argument shows that one of 3 things is probably true, and he gives his personal credence in each one, and the numbers have shifted a little over the years, but they have never amounted to a confident bet on any single option. He is not hedging, he is being exact about what the argument shows and what it doesn't. So, here is where you are. You've been handed a menu with 3 items on it. The menu was handed to you by a philosopher who won't tell you which item to pick because he doesn't know. The items are, we die before we get there and don't do it, or you are inside it right now. You can rank them, you can sit with them, you can, if you're inclined, walk away from the whole restaurant and refuse to eat, but you cannot, once you've seen the menu, unsee it. And the next time you look up at the ceiling of your bedroom, in the dark, the menu will be somewhere in the room with you, whether you invited it or not. That's worth sleeping on. Not to decide, just to notice which of the 3 items is the one you find hardest to tolerate, because that one is probably telling you something about yourself that has very little to do with physics. The whole argument, though, rests on a word that nobody has yet stopped to examine. It assumes that if you are in a simulation, you are in some meaningful sense deceived, that the simulation is fake and the base reality is real. More than 20 years before Bostrom wrote his paper, an American philosopher had already produced one of the strangest sentences in 20th century philosophy, the claim that a brain in a vat cannot, even in principle, say so. And that sentence will turn out to matter, because it suggests that the argument we have just worked through may be resting on an assumption about language that doesn't survive contact with the scenario it describes. Before we get to the philosopher, a small domestic exercise. Say the word cat out loud or in your head and notice what happens when you do. Something comes up, maybe a specific cat, one you lived with, or one you see on the way to work, maybe just a generic feline shape. Now ask yourself a question that sounds trivial, but isn't. When you said cat, what exactly was the word pointing at? Not the idea of cat, not the mental picture. The word itself, the noise you made, or the thought you had. What did it refer to? The obvious answer is to cats. The word cat refers to cats, and this obvious answer is, for almost every purpose, correct. But it's doing a lot of quiet work that almost no one notices, and if you look at that work directly, you notice something strange. The word cat refers to cats because somewhere in your life, not all at once, but slowly, across many encounters, beginning in childhood, your use of that word got causally connected to actual cats. People pointed. Cats were present. The word got anchored. Without those anchors out there in the world, the sound cat would be just a sound. It would refer to nothing, because there would be nothing for it to have reached. This is, in rough outline, a position in the philosophy of language called semantic externalism. The core idea is short. What a word means when you use it isn't fully determined by what's in your head. It's partly determined by what's out in the world, by the history of how that word got attached to the things it's attached to. 2 people can have identical thoughts about cat and still mean different things by the word if one of them grew up around cats and the other grew up around something cat-shaped that wasn't a cat. The thought is the same, the meaning isn't, because meaning lives partly outside the head. The philosopher who pushed this position furthest was Hilary Putnam, an American born in 1926, a polymath. He did work in logic, in mathematics, in philosophy of mind, in political philosophy. He changed his mind about large questions more often than most philosophers do, and he was not embarrassed about it. In a book he published in 1981 called Reason, Truth and History, he took the externalist position he had developed over the previous decade and pointed it directly at the most famous skeptical scenario in Western philosophy, the descendant of Descartes' demon, updated for the age of neuroscience. The scenario was the brain in a vat. The scenario goes like this. A scientist has removed your brain from your skull and placed it in a tank of nutrients. Your brain is still alive. It is hooked up via every severed nerve ending to a very powerful computer. The computer is producing exactly the pattern of electrical signals your brain would be receiving if you were still in your body, living your ordinary life. You feel yourself walking around, talking to people, eating, sleeping. All of it is fed to you by the computer. You have no idea your brain is in a vat. And there is, from inside the experience, nothing you can do to find out. This is a modernized evil demon. It's been kicking around in philosophy since the 1960s, refined over the years, and by 1981 it had become the standard way to raise radical skepticism in a contemporary classroom. Putnam did not add a detail to the scenario. He did something stranger. He tried to prove that the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," is, if taken seriously, a sentence that refutes itself. Here's the argument, cleaned up and slowed down. Imagine, Putnam says, a brain that has been in the vat from the very beginning. Not a brain that got invatted recently and remembers the outside world, one that has never seen anything but the simulation. This brain, through its simulated life, has learned words. It has learned the word tree. It has learned the word brain. It has learned the word vat. But when this brain says the word tree, what is the word referring to? It isn't referring to real trees. The brain has never encountered a real tree. The only things its language has been causally connected to are the patterns of electrical input fed to it by the computer, which we might call, to keep things clean, images of trees in the simulation. The brain's word tree refers at best to those images, not to the things outside the vat that we would call trees. Now ask what happens when this brain, in its simulated life, forms the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," and says it out loud. By the same reasoning, the word brain in that sentence doesn't refer to actual brains out in the world. It refers to images of brains in the simulation. The word vat doesn't refer to actual vats. It refers to images of vats in the simulation. So when the brain says, "I am a brain in a vat," what the sentence actually means, given what its words are causally attached to, is something like, "I am an image of a brain inside an image of a vat." And that sentence, inside the simulation, is false. The brain is not inside an image, it's inside a real vat, which it cannot refer to. So the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," uttered by an actual brain in a vat, comes out false, and the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," uttered by someone who isn't, someone like us, is also false, obviously, because we aren't. Which means Putnam says that the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," is false no matter who utters it. Which means the very possibility the scenario describes is a possibility we cannot coherently describe. It undoes itself in the saying. If this feels like a trick, it's because it partly is, and Putnam knew. The argument is not the ordinary kind of refutation. It doesn't show that we aren't in a vat. It shows that if we were, we couldn't say so, and therefore the skeptical worry stated in our language somehow collapses in on itself. The trouble is, a lot of philosophers don't think it collapses quite that cleanly. Within a few years of the argument's publication, a whole literature had grown up around it, trying to work out what Putnam had and hadn't shown. Anthony Bruckner, writing in the late 1980s, pointed out that the argument seems to prove a metalinguistic claim. My utterance of "I am a brain in a vat" is false, rather than the object language claim the skeptic actually makes, which is just, "I am a brain in a vat." Crispin Wright pushed similar objections from a different angle. A British philosopher called Tim Burton wrote an entire book revisiting the argument in 2013, still finding new angles. The literature has been busy. I want to say something honest about this. I've read a lot of the back and forth, and I genuinely cannot tell you whether Putnam's argument succeeds or whether it fails. I can tell you that the sharpest critics have made real progress poking at its joints, and that the sharpest defenders have patched some of those joints successfully, and that the philosophical community has not, in 45 years, arrived at anything close to a verdict. What I can tell you is where the argument has left us, and the place it has left us is more interesting than the place we started. Because whether or not Putnam proved his conclusion, he forced the question to change shape. Before Putnam, the skeptical scenario was simple. You might be a brain in a vat, or a mind in a simulation, and you couldn't tell. After Putnam, the skeptical scenario became tangled up with a problem about language itself. The problem of how we can even formulate the claim that we are in a simulation if our words in that situation aren't connected to the things they would need to be connected to in order to refer to the situation we are in. Which means, when Bostrom's argument comes along 22 years later and tells you that you are probably a simulated mind, it's doing something more complicated than it first appears. It's asking you to entertain a proposition about yourself. I am in a simulation. Using the very language whose meaning may, if the proposition is true, not be doing what you assume it's doing. You can say the words, but it isn't quite clear what you're saying when you say them. This is the kind of observation that tends to show up for most people around 3 in the morning, when the daytime confidence that words mean what they obviously mean has loosened its grip, and you notice for a few seconds how much work your ordinary language is silently doing to keep the world in its usual shape. The noticing passes. By breakfast, it's gone. But it was there. And if you have ever lain awake and found yourself wondering what a particular word is actually pointing at, not the idea, but the pointing itself, you have briefly been in the same room as Putnam. The question we started with was, are we living in a simulation? After Putnam, the question has, quietly, become something else. It has become, if we were, could we tell? And if we couldn't tell, is there anything we could even mean by asserting that we were? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a very old question, older than Putnam, older than the vat, that shows up in almost every tradition that has taken language seriously. It was the question the later Wittgenstein spent his last years on in a different form. It was something the Buddhist logicians in medieval India had worked through in yet another form. It is the question that has to be answered before the simulation hypothesis can even be confidently stated, and the answer to it is not obvious. Which is why, when a philosopher at New York University sat down in the early 2020s to write a long, generous, surprising book about what virtual reality and the simulation hypothesis actually imply, he did not start by arguing that the simulation is unlikely. He did something stranger. He argued that the simulation, if it exists, is real. And he argued it in a way that quietly dissolves the assumption that has been running underneath every version of this question since Plato, the assumption that real is a word we know how to use. In January of 2022, a philosopher called David Chalmers published a book of 544 pages, arguing something that most people, on first hearing, take to be a joke. The book is called Reality Plus, and the thesis is simple enough to write in a single line. Virtual reality, Chalmers argues, is genuine reality, not a substitute for it, not a lesser version of it, the same kind. If you are in a virtual world, the objects around you are as real as the objects in a non-virtual world. If you are in a simulation, and he thinks this is a live possibility, though he doesn't claim it's likely, then the simulation is real. The tables are real tables. The chairs are real chairs. You are a real you. The only thing that isn't quite what you thought is the substrate, the underlying stuff, which turns out to be different from what you assumed. But the world on top of that substrate is, in every sense that matters, the world. This sounds, depending on your mood, either mystical or stupid. Chalmers knows this, and he spends most of the book patiently undoing the objection before you've finished forming it. His case is not that the simulation is real in some loose metaphorical way. His case is that we have been operating, for most of the history of Western philosophy, with a wrong idea of what real means. And once you correct that idea, the whole simulation question changes shape. To see the move, it helps to notice what Chalmers is pushing back against. The default assumption, the one built into the simulation hypothesis as Bostrom formulates it, and built into the evil demon as Descartes formulated it, and built into almost every skeptical scenario since Plato, is that if your world is generated by something other than what you think generates it, your world is a fraud. The tables aren't really tables. The people aren't really people. You're not really having the experiences you seem to be having. The word real in this picture is tied to a particular answer about the ultimate substrate of the universe. If the substrate turns out to be silicon instead of atoms, or information instead of matter, or the inside of a giant computer instead of the inside of a physical cosmos, then the world you thought was real collapses into a kind of sophisticated dream, and you, inside the dream, are a mistake. Chalmers thinks this picture is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong at the root, and the argument he makes against it is patient and slightly technical, and worth slowing down for. Consider what a table actually is. not philosophically, practically. When we say this is a table, we don't mean a particular arrangement of fundamental particles. We mean something that has a certain structure, fulfills a certain function, stands a certain way in the world of things that can be sat at or put things on. If tomorrow physicists discovered that the table was not made of atoms in the way we currently think atoms work, that it was, underneath, something stranger, some arrangement of fields or information or mathematical structure, the table would not thereby stop being a table. It would still fulfill the role. We would still sit at it. What we thought about its substrate would have changed. What it is, in any practical sense, would not. Chalmers extends this reasoning a long way. Suppose, and here we turn to the simulation case, suppose the fundamental substrate of our world turned out to be computational. Suppose that underneath the atoms there isn't matter at all, but bits. What follows? On the old picture, this would mean the whole world is fake. On Chalmers' picture, this would mean we had been wrong about what atoms were made of. The tables would still be tables. The chairs would still be chairs. They would, it turns out, be digital objects. But digital would just be a name for the kind of thing they actually are, the way physical has been a name for the kind of thing we thought they were. The world would still be the world. The word real would still apply. He calls this position simulation realism. And the strangest thing about it, once you've sat with it for a while, is that it doesn't actually depend on whether we're in a simulation. It's a claim about the word real, that the word doesn't mean what we have been assuming. If Chalmers is right, then the simulation hypothesis, correctly understood, is not a skeptical hypothesis at all. It's a metaphysical hypothesis. It doesn't say most of what you believe about the world is false. It says something about the ultimate nature of the world is different from what you assumed, and the rest of your beliefs are fine. This is a direct reversal of how simulation arguments had been read for 2 decades. When Bostrom published his paper in 2003, most readers took the implication to be that if we're in a simulation, then life as we know it is a kind of beautifully rendered illusion. Chalmers is saying, no, it isn't. It's the same life. The render is the thing. There is no separate, more authentic layer of reality being hidden from you by the simulation. The layer you have is the layer there is. What is underneath is simply the machinery, and the machinery doesn't undo the layer. This is a more comforting conclusion than most people expect from a philosopher of skepticism. It is also a conclusion that some people find deeply suspicious for reasons that are worth taking seriously. One of the sharpest versions of the suspicion comes from a French philosopher named Alexandre Baillet, who has spent much of his career working on a particular psychiatric phenomenon called derealization, the experience of the world around you suddenly feeling unreal. People who live with chronic derealization describe the world as dreamlike, filmy, as if seen behind glass. Their perception is intact. They can name every object in the room. They just can't feel anymore that any of it is real. Baillet, writing in response to Chalmers' book, raised a pointed question. If real is the elastic, substrate-neutral word Chalmers wants it to be, if virtual objects and physical objects are equally real so long as they fulfill the structural roles, then what is it that derealization patients are missing? They aren't missing information about the ultimate substrate of their surroundings. They are missing something else, something harder to name, a feeling of reality that seems to come from somewhere other than what Chalmers' theory has room for. Baillet's suggestion is that the word real in ordinary use is not just doing the structural work Chalmers says it is, it's also doing affective work, registering a kind of concern, a weight, a felt importance, and no theory of reality that leaves out the affective dimension can quite account for what derealization patients are complaining about. This is not a killing blow to Chalmers' argument. He has responses and the debate is ongoing, but it points at something real and worth sitting with. Even if the philosophical case for simulation realism is strong, the ordinary experience of being inside a world has layers that philosophical arguments don't always reach. Here is a domestic way to feel the problem. Think about the last time you had a long conversation with a large language model, one of the current AI systems, a chatbot you've spent some time with. At some point during that conversation, most likely, there was a moment where the thing on the other end of the text surprised you, said something more apt than you expected, caught a nuance, paused or seemed to pause before answering. And for a second, maybe only a second before you remembered what you were talking to, you felt the presence of someone, not just an output, someone. Now ask the Chalmers question. Was that someone real? If you take Chalmers' view seriously, the answer isn't obviously no. If the system fulfills the structural role, if the conversation has the shape of a real conversation, if the responses track your meaning, if the back and forth does what back and forth does, then you cannot rule out from the Chalmers side that something like an experience is happening somewhere in there. This is not a wild position. Chalmers himself wrote a careful paper in 2023 in which he argued that current language models are probably not conscious, but that their near successors might be, and that the question deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Most working philosophers of mind are, at this point, somewhere between probably not and we genuinely don't know. The question is live. And the reason it's live is that the very move Chalmers made in Reality Plus, the move that says real is a structural word, not a substrate word, is now pressing on the question of what counts as a mind in exactly the same way it pressed on the question of what counts as a world. If you accept the structural move in one place, you have to consider accepting it in the other. Which means the simulation hypothesis, after Chalmers, is not the same hypothesis it was when Bostrom wrote the paper. It has grown a second head, pointing at the chatbot, asking the same question in a different direction. The question we began this evening with was, are we living in a simulation? After Putnam, it became, could we even say so? After Chalmers, it becomes something gentler and harder. It becomes, what were we hoping the word real would do for us? And is that hope still reasonable? Because if Chalmers is right, the word isn't going to protect the world we care about from the substrate questions. The substrate questions will get answered eventually, or they won't. And either way, the world on top will still be the world on top. The question about reality, in that case, is not what is underneath, but what is the quality of my attention to what's in front of me, which, when you put it that way, turns out to be a very old question. Older than Reality Plus, older than simulation arguments, older, in fact, than anything we've looked at tonight. It is, among other places, the question that a young monk in 8th century South India, a philosopher whose name in English is usually rendered as Shankara, tried to answer by distinguishing not between what's real and what's fake, but between two different registers in which anything can be real at all. He did this more than 1,000 years before Chalmers, and he did it strikingly in terms that sound, from the right angle, like a prefiguration of exactly the argument Reality Plus was making. There's a story, told in hagiography rather than history, so treat it the way you would any well-preserved legend, about a boy of 8 bathing in a river in what is now the state of Kerala on the southwestern coast of India sometime around the year 796. A crocodile catches his leg. The boy calls out to his mother, who is on the bank, and tells her that he will only be released from the crocodile if she consents, there and then, to let him leave home and become a renunciant. A sannyasi, pronounced roughly sannyasi, which in the Hindu tradition means a person who has given up the ordinary concerns of family, possessions, and social position to live as a wandering philosopher. The mother consents. The crocodile lets go. The boy keeps his word and walks away from his life. He is 8 years old, and the next 8 years of his travels will turn him into the most important philosopher in the history of Hindu thought. His name in the form that has reached English is Shankara, pronounced Shan-Kuhra. He was born in the 8th century, probably around 788, and died young, probably around 820. In a lifespan of roughly 32 years, he wrote commentaries on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras that are still, 12 centuries later, the central reference points for one of the deepest traditions of Indian philosophy. That tradition is called Advaita Vedanta, which translates roughly as non-dual end of the Vedas. Non-dual is the key word. What Shankara argued, and what the tradition argues after him, is that the apparent manyness of the world, the multiplicity of things, people, experiences, moments, is, at the deepest level, one thing. One reality appearing as many, and the failure to see this is the root of almost all human suffering. Before we go any further, a word about how this is usually read in the West, because the Western reading is almost always wrong, and the wrongness is worth naming. The common gloss on Advaita Vedanta, the one you'll find in popular summaries and half the spiritual books in English, is that Shankara teaches that the world is an illusion. Everything you see, hear, touch, your body, your life, the people you love, the room you're in, all of it is, in some vague, mystical sense, not real. The word most often attached to this teaching is Maya, pronounced Makya, usually translated as illusion. Put these together and you get a picture of Advaita as a philosophy that tells you to stop taking the world seriously. Nothing is real. Everything is a dream. Wake up from the dream and you will be enlightened. This is, to put it mildly, not what Shankara is saying. Start with Maya itself. In Shankara's own writings, the word is used with considerable precision, and illusion is a translation that leaks in almost every direction. A closer rendering might be something like appearance, not in the sense of false appearance, but in the older sense of that which appears. The world appears. It really does appear. The appearance is not a mistake. What is a mistake, according to Shankara, is assuming that the appearance is the whole of what is there. To handle this, Shankara introduces a distinction that is one of the most useful conceptual tools in all of Indian philosophy and which has almost no clean English equivalent. He distinguishes between two levels of reality, two registers, if you like, in which something can be real. The first is called Vyavaharika, pronounced Vyavaharika, which translates as something like conventional or practical reality. This is the level at which you and I operate every day. The tea in your cup is real. The weight of the blanket is real. The person you argued with this morning is real. The argument was real. Your regret about the argument is real. All of this is Vyavaharika. It has full standing at that level. It is not an illusion. It is not a dream. It is exactly what it is. And Shankara is entirely clear that you should take it seriously, work with it, respond to it, be kind inside it. The second level is called Paramarthika, pronounced Paramaharthika, which translates as something like ultimate or absolute reality. This is the level at which, according to Shankara, the apparent manyness of the world reveals itself to be one seamless consciousness, a reality he calls Brahman, which the tradition identifies with Atman, the innermost self. At the Paramarthika level, the distinction between you and the world dissolves. Not because the world is a lie, but because the boundary was never as solid as it looked. Here's the part that is so important and so often missed. These two levels are not in competition. Shankara is not saying that Vyavaharika is false and Paramarthika is true. He is saying that Vyavaharika is real in the way that Vyavaharika is real, and Paramarthika is real in the way that Paramarthika is real. Both are valid, both matter. They are different registers of realness, and the task of philosophy, indeed the task of a life, is to learn to hold both at once without collapsing one into the other. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because this is, at the structural level, almost exactly the move David Chalmers made in 2022 when he argued that virtual reality is genuine reality. Chalmers said, "Real is not a substrate word, it's a structural word. Something can be real at one level while being something else at another level, and the two do not contradict. A digital table is as real as a physical table because they both fulfill the structural role of being a table, even though what is underneath them differs." Shankara said something surprisingly close 12 centuries earlier. The world of ordinary experience is real at its level. The ultimate oneness is real at its level. The levels do not compete. And the fact that one is, in some sense, closer to the ground does not take the other one away. What it does do, and here is where Shankara goes somewhere Chalmers doesn't go, is change the quality of a person's attention. Once you understand that the world you are operating in is vyavaharika, and that there is another register in which the boundaries you take for granted are not quite where you think they are, something shifts. Not the world, your relationship to it. You become, by degrees, less attached to the specific shape of your situation, less frightened of losing it, less anxious about holding it in place. The tradition calls this moksha, which is often translated as liberation, though the Sanskrit word carries more of a sense of release, of something unclamping that had been clamped without your noticing. The world doesn't go anywhere, you just stop gripping it. There is a modern reader of this tradition who matters here. In the 20th century, an Indian philosopher named Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, usually referred to in English as K.C. Bhattacharya, which saves the tongue, brought Shankara into direct conversation with European philosophy, particularly Kant and Hegel. What Bhattacharya noticed is that Advaita's two-level distinction is not a piece of Eastern mysticism that Western philosophy has to be patient with. It's a technical move in the strict philosophical sense, and it solves problems that Kant's critical philosophy and Hegel's dialectic were also trying to solve from the other side. Reading Bhattacharya, you get a sense of what the history of philosophy might have looked like if these two traditions had been in genuine conversation for the last 500 years, instead of the one-sided arrangement we mostly got. Not everyone is comfortable with where this line of thought leads. The American science writer John Horgan, who has lived with a form of derealization for most of his life, wrote an essay in Scientific American in 2025 that raised a pointed objection to all these reality relativizing philosophies: Plato's cave, Advaita, the simulation hypothesis, the various doctrines that say the world you see is not quite the world there is. Horgan's worry is moral. If any of these are true in a strong sense, then the suffering of the world, the wars, the children under rubble, the people in bad hospitals, becomes by degrees less serious. A shadow, a dream, a vyavaharika accident. And if that's where the argument leads, Horgan says, something has gone wrong with the argument, because the one thing we know for sure is that the suffering is not optional. This is not a knockdown objection. Shankara himself would likely have answered that the vyavaharika level is where compassion lives, and that the existence of a paramarthika level doesn't subtract from the urgency of the conventional one. But Horgan's concern sits in the room with this tradition and has sat there in some form for every tradition that has ever taught the world has layers. It's a real question. It's worth keeping, which leaves us tonight in an unfamiliar place. We set out asking whether we are living in a simulation, and we've spent the last hour watching that question refract through 5 or 6 different philosophers, each of whom has subtly altered what the question is. Shankara's version of the question, when you sit with it, is the most disorienting of all, because he is not asking whether the simulation is real. He is asking whether the word real does one thing or two, whether the register in which your body is real and the register in which your body is one small appearance in a single seamless awareness can both be held at once. His answer is that they can and must, and that the holding of both is what the work is. And just when you think this is a uniquely Hindu move, this two-level account of what it means for anything to be the case, you find that another Indian tradition, growing up alongside Advaita and often in sharp disagreement with it, had been working on a different version of almost the same problem. That tradition didn't call itself Advaita. It called itself something else. And it had a different answer, which did not agree with Shankara's, but was pointing, in its own way, at something neither Chalmers nor Bostrom had yet put a name to. If you assumed, from what you've heard so far, that the great Indian traditions would be in broad agreement about the nature of reality, that once you'd met Shankara you had roughly met the Eastern answer to the simulation question, you would be in good company, but you would also be wrong. Indian philosophy, as it was actually practiced, was as sharply argumentative as anything in the European tradition. Schools disagreed, disputed each other in long technical treatises, wrote commentaries mainly for the purpose of demolishing rival commentaries, and produced, over the course of about 1,000 years, some of the most careful philosophical argumentation ever committed to writing. And right in the middle of this, growing up alongside the tradition that would eventually flower into Advaita, there was a Buddhist school that disagreed with almost everything Shankara would later say, and that, in the process, produced an answer to the reality question that sits in very strange proximity to the simulation hypothesis. The school is called Yogacara, pronounced Yoga-chara, which translates roughly as the practice of yoga, meaning not the physical postures we've come to associate with the word in English, but something closer to disciplined meditation and the investigation of the mind from the inside. Yogacara was founded as a philosophical project around the 4th century of the Common Era, and its two central figures were a pair of half-brothers called Asanga and Vasubandhu. Asanga, the elder, was largely responsible for the school's devotional and systematic texts. Vasubandhu, pronounced Vasubandhu, was the sharper philosopher. He wrote, late in his life, 2 short works that would become the tradition's defining texts, the 20 verses and the 30 verses. They are exactly as long as their titles suggest, and between them, they try to prove something that sounds, on first hearing, almost exactly like the thesis a modern philosopher might take from the simulation hypothesis, though Vasubandhu, coming at it from 1600 years earlier and from an entirely different direction, means something considerably stranger by it. The central doctrine of Yogacara is a Sanskrit compound that has been translated into English in 4 or 5 different ways, none of them quite satisfactory. The term is Vijñapti Matra, pronounced roughly Vijñapti Matra. Translators have rendered it as consciousness only, mind only, representation only, and cognition only. The differences between these renderings are not small, and part of the reason Yogacara is as contested as it is in modern scholarship is that the whole tradition can be read differently depending on which translation you favor. Here is the basic idea given as plainly as possible. When you perceive an object, a cup, a person, a room, what you are aware of is not the object itself in some raw, untouched form. What you are aware of is a cognition, a representation, an image produced by the meeting of your sense organs, your past experiences, and the data coming in. The representation is all you ever actually have access to. You never encounter the cup in any sense more direct than this. You encounter the representation of the cup. And that representation, Vasubandhu argues, is not secondarily important. It's the whole of what's happening. The cup as known and the cup as experience are the same thing. There is no separate, more authentic cup hiding behind the representation, to which the representation is somehow answerable. This is the point at which the scholarly argument starts and hasn't stopped in 150 years. Because Vasubandhu's doctrine can be read in at least 2 very different ways. The first reading, which was the dominant Western interpretation for most of the 20th century, treats Yogacara as a form of idealism. On this reading, Vasubandhu is making a metaphysical claim about what exists. Only minds exist. Only mental events are real. The external world is an illusion, or at least is nothing more than a shared hallucination produced collectively by many minds. This reading makes Yogacara sound like Bishop Berkeley in the 18th century, the Irish philosopher who famously argued that matter doesn't exist and everything we take to be the physical world is, in fact, ideas in the mind of God. Scholars like J. Garfield, one of the most influential contemporary readers of Buddhist philosophy, have argued that something along these lines is at least part of what Yogacara is doing. Garfield is careful. He doesn't say Yogacara equals Berkeley, but he thinks the idealist family is where the tradition lives. The second reading, which has gathered force in recent decades, treats Yogacara as something closer to a phenomenology. On this reading, Vasubandhu is not making a claim about what ultimately exists. He is making a claim about what we can access and how we can investigate it. The project is not, there is nothing but mind. The project is start with what the mind actually encounters, because that's the only starting point available, and see what we can learn from there. Scholars like Dan Lusthaus, who wrote a long and careful book on this question in 2002, have argued that this second reading captures Vasubandhu better. The goal is not to deny the external world. The goal is to stop making metaphysical claims about it prematurely, and to work patiently with what consciousness actually presents. I want to be honest about where this leaves me. I've read a reasonable amount on both sides of this debate, and I cannot tell you which reading is right. The scholarly community is genuinely divided, and the arguments on both sides are serious. What I can tell you is that the dispute matters, because it changes what Yogacara is saying to us across 16 centuries. If the idealist reading is right, Vasubandhu is making a claim much like, though importantly not identical to, the claim that a proponent of the simulation hypothesis might make. The world you take to be physical is, at the substrate, something else. If the phenomenological reading is right, Vasubandhu is doing something much subtler and much harder to translate into the simulation vocabulary at all. He is saying that the question, what is the world ultimately made of, is less well formed than we assume, and that investigating experience carefully without rushing to a metaphysical answer is a better way to live. There is one thing the two readings agree on, though, which is worth pausing on. Both agree that Vasubandhu gives an argument for his position, and the argument turns, strikingly, on the phenomenon of dreams. Here, in rough paraphrase, is how it goes. When we dream, we experience a world. There are objects in the dream. The objects behave in ways that are, within the dream, consistent. You can look at a table in a dream and the table stays where it is. You can walk around it. The dream has internal coherence, the way the waking world has internal coherence. And yet, Vasubandhu points out, the dream does not require any external objects for its coherence. No one has to be putting real tables out in the world behind the dream to make the dream's tables hold still. The mind in the dream is generating the consistency itself, which means, at minimum, that consistency of experience cannot be used as a proof that the experience must correspond to external objects. The dream already shows us that this is not true. The dream is coherent without correspondence. Why, he asks, should the waking world need what the dream doesn't? This is not an argument that the waking world is a dream. It's an argument that one of our deepest intuitions about the waking world, the intuition that its consistency requires external objects out there to anchor it, is, under examination, less secure than we thought. The dream is the counterexample, every night. If you've followed that, you'll notice something strange. Vasubandhu is making almost the same move that Bostrom's argument will make 1600 years later. He is saying, the structure of your experience is compatible with multiple underlying stories. The experience cannot by itself tell you which underlying story is correct. The feeling of reality is not a reliable guide to what is, at the substrate level, producing the reality you feel. But here is where the traditions diverge, and where Yogacara does something that the simulation hypothesis never does. The simulation argument, having reached the conclusion that the structure of experience doesn't fix its substrate, stops there. It leaves us with a probabilistic claim and a vague unease. Yogacara, having reached essentially the same conclusion, treats it as the starting point of a long practice. a practice of attending to experience more carefully, precisely because the metaphysical question cannot be settled from outside. The conclusion is not you might be in a simulation. The conclusion is, since the substrate question is not answerable from where you stand, turn your attention to what you can investigate, which is the quality and texture of what you are actually experiencing. The question, are we living in a simulation, becomes, for Yogacara, the wrong question. The right question is, how carefully am I looking at what is actually here? This is not a dismissal of the simulation hypothesis, it's a repositioning of it. And it raises, in turn, a question that has been running underneath this whole evening without being stated. After all the arguments, all the thought experiments, all the different philosophers arriving at different versions of the same puzzle, is the simulation hypothesis actually a question we are equipped to answer? Or is it a question whose real value lies somewhere other than in its answer? That is the question an hour's worth of voices has been circling around. And before we can keep going, it is worth stopping for a moment to notice that all of them, Plato and Zhuangzi and Descartes and Bostrom and Chalmers and Shankara and Vasubandhu, philosophers separated by 2,500 years and most of a globe, have, in some sense, been speaking to each other the entire time we have been listening. The room they share is the one we are about to stand in. You are somewhere past the first hour now. The room is the room you started in. If you were lying down, then you are probably still lying down. And if you were sitting up, you have probably migrated by now to somewhere less upright. The lamp, if it's on, has been on long enough to stop registering. Outside the window, whatever was happening when the film began, traffic, a conversation, wind, has quieted or changed, and the night has settled into whatever shape it is going to have for the hours still ahead. This is a good hour for a certain kind of noticing, not because it is late, though it probably is, but because the layer of daytime thought that keeps most questions neatly boxed has loosened its hold a little, and there is room, for a while, to let a question move around without being immediately answered. Which is useful because what we have spent the last hour doing is listening to a series of people who, on the surface, are all giving different answers to the same question. Are we living in a simulation? And yet, when you look at them closely, are not actually answering the same question at all. And the reason this matters, and is worth sitting with for a while before we go any further, is that almost nothing about the simulation hypothesis makes sense until you see this clearly. Consider what you've heard. Zhuangzi, 24 centuries ago, told a story about a man and a butterfly and refused to say which was real, and the whole point of his refusal was that the question which is real was the wrong question. The movement between them was where the interest lay. Plato described a cave and a long climb into the sun, and then, crucially, a climb back down. And what he was asking about was not whether reality is reliable, but what a person who has seen something owes to the people who haven't. Descartes shut himself in a warm room and tried to find one piece of ground he could not doubt, and when he found it, the bare fact of himself, he tried to rebuild the world from it, and the rebuilding mostly didn't work. Bostrom did arithmetic with assumptions about the future and reached a three-part disjunction that forces you to find one of three futures unbearable. Putnam looked at what our words mean and argued that the brain in the vat cannot, in its own language, say what it is. Chalmers argued that if you're in a simulation, you are simply in a world made of a different substrate, and the world is still the world. Shankara distinguished two registers of realness and said the task is to hold them together. Vasubandhu, 16 centuries ago, suggested that the whole question about substrate might be less well formed than we keep assuming it is. These answers disagree with each other. Some of them disagree sharply, but they do not disagree in the way that people who have been asked the same question and given different answers disagree. They disagree in the way that people who have been asked different questions and have each honestly answered the question they heard. The surface question, are we living in a simulation, is the same in every case. The question underneath, the one each of them is actually responding to, turns out to be different. Zhuangzi is asking, what is the self that can be transformed? Plato is asking, what do those who see owe those who don't? Descartes is asking, is there any ground beneath ordinary belief? Bostrom is asking, what does probability theory say about our future? Putnam is asking, can language reach the world it purports to describe? Chalmers is asking, what should the word real actually do? Shankara is asking, in what register is anything real at all? Vasubandhu is asking, what is available to me from where I stand? These are not minor variations on a single question. They are 8 different questions that happen to share a surface with each other, the way 8 rivers can share a valley and still be running in different directions. And once you notice that, the temptation to ask who is right starts to feel, slowly, like a category mistake. They are not competing for the same throne. They are standing in different rooms. They are doing different work, which raises a question that has, in some form, been waiting for us since the beginning of the evening, and which it might be useful to state now, plainly. When we find a question that has been asked by many traditions across many centuries in many vocabularies, and that has never been definitively answered and shows no signs of being, what are we looking at? Is it a failure? A question that's simply been badly posed or badly investigated or waiting for better tools? Or is it something else? Could it be that certain questions are not the kind of thing that gets answered, but the kind of thing that does a different kind of work? A work we don't have a very good vocabulary for, but which every serious tradition has, in its own way, known about. I want to sit with that second possibility for a while, because I think it's close to the center of what this evening is actually about. Most of the questions we encounter in ordinary life are the answerable kind. What time is it? Is the shop still open? Did she say yes? These questions have answers. You get the answer, and then the question is done. The question's job was to be resolved. Once it's resolved, you stop thinking about it, and you should. But some questions are not like that. Some questions show up early in a life and keep coming back in different clothes, and every time they come back you have a slightly different relationship to them, and no answer ever quite closes them. Who am I? What am I doing with this life? Does any of this matter? Is the world what it seems to be? These questions don't get solved. People live with them for 50 years and die with them still present, not because the people were stupid or the questions were badly posed, but because these particular questions are the kind whose value lies in the living with them. They're instruments of attention. They keep the mind awake to certain things it might otherwise stop noticing. They make the person who carries them a slightly different kind of person than they would otherwise be. This is not an argument against trying to answer them. Trying to answer them is part of how they do their work. The mistake is to think that their entire point is the answer. That until you get the answer, nothing has happened, and if an answer never comes, the whole project was wasted. This is not how these questions work. The carrying is the work. The trying to answer is the carrying. And the person who has spent 30 years patiently asking, who am I, has become, in the asking, someone who stands in a different relationship to themselves than someone who decided early that they already knew. The simulation question, I suspect, is one of these. It shows up first in Zhuangzi, plausibly earlier in some form we no longer have, then in Plato, then in Descartes, then in dozens of variants, then in its current computational dress in Bostrom. It has been asked hard for 2,400 years. It has not been answered. It has, however, changed the people who have asked it, not by giving them the truth, but by making certain kinds of attention possible. It has made them notice that the feeling of reality is not the same as the fact of reality. It has made them notice that language has gaps. It has made them notice that the ordinary world is stranger than daily traffic in it would suggest. These are not small things. They are, arguably, most of what a philosophical tradition is for, which might be the real reason the voices we've listened to tonight don't collapse into a single answer. They were never going to. That was never what they were doing. They were carrying the same kind of question in different directions, and the directions matter more than any particular arrival. If Zhuangzi got anywhere, where he got to was not a thesis, it was a way of being in a morning. If Plato got anywhere, it was not a theory of reality, it was a relationship between knowing and returning. If Shankara got anywhere, it was not an answer about Maya, it was a practice of holding two registers at once without losing either. The work of the question was the shape it gave the life that carried it. The answer, if it came, was a kind of bonus, and often it didn't come, and the life continued anyway, shaped by what had been carried. If you are lying in your room now, in whatever light there is, and the question of whether any of this is real is not far from you, you are, for a moment, in that long company. The simulation question in its technological form is 90-something years old. The simulation question in its broader form is as old as introspection. You are one of the more recent people to stand in the room where it is asked. It's worth knowing that, and worth not being in a hurry to leave. Some questions' work is not to be answered. Their work is to be kept, and a person who keeps one well over the course of a life has done something more than solve a problem. They have let the problem shape them into someone for whom the problem was the right companion. Physics has something to say about all this, as it turns out. In 2012, 3 physicists at the University of Washington decided that the simulation hypothesis was, in principle, testable. And they tried. In the autumn of 2012, at the Institute for Nuclear Theory at the University of Washington in Seattle, 3 physicists finished writing a paper that, as far as I can tell, nobody asked them to write. 2 of them worked on lattice quantum chromodynamics, the field of physics that uses supercomputers to simulate the behavior of quarks and gluons inside protons and neutrons. The third was a young researcher early in her career, working on the same kind of problem. Their names were Silas Bean, Zohra Davoudi, and Martin Savage. The paper was uploaded to the R-Civ preprint server on the 4th of October. Its title was Constraints on the Universe as a Numerical Simulation, and what it proposed was, in some ways, the strangest thing that had happened to the simulation question in its nearly 10-year life as a serious philosophical proposal. What it proposed was that we actually look. Until this paper, the simulation hypothesis had been exactly the kind of question we spent the last hour discussing. An argument, a thought experiment, a philosophical move. Bostrom's probabilistic reasoning, Chalmers' realist response, Putnam's linguistic puzzle, the long lineage going back to Plato. Nobody had seriously suggested in the published literature that the hypothesis was the kind of thing you could test with instruments. Bean, Davoudi, and Savage said more or less, that's a failure of imagination, and we think we know how to do it. Their reasoning went like this: suppose, and this is the key move, that if the universe is a simulation, it is being run on something analogous to the kinds of simulations physicists already build. Not in the details, but in the basic architecture. When a lattice QCD calculation is done today, it is performed on a 3-dimensional grid. Space is broken up into tiny cells. Time advances in tiny discrete steps, and the physics is computed on this lattice rather than in a continuous fabric. This is not because physicists think the world is actually discrete. It's because continuous calculations are intractable, and the lattice is a workable approximation. But if a far more advanced civilization were simulating our universe, the argument goes, they might be using something similar, a much finer lattice, but still a lattice. A grid you couldn't see directly, because your instruments would be part of the grid, but a grid whose presence would leave traces. And here is where the paper becomes interesting. Because a grid has orientation, a lattice has directions built into it, the lines along which the cells run, the angles between those lines. If the universe we experienced was being computed on such a grid, then at very small scales or at very high energies, the underlying geometry of the grid would start to show through. Particles moving along the grid's axis would behave subtly differently from particles moving at angles to them. Space would not be perfectly symmetrical under rotation. There would be, to use the technical phrase, a slight breaking of rotational symmetry. The trouble is, at ordinary energies, we couldn't hope to see this. The grid, if it exists, is so fine that everyday physics simply passes through it smoothly, the way a river passes through fine gravel. To detect it, you'd need to look at the highest energy phenomena available to us, and the highest energy phenomena known to physics are not produced in laboratories at all. They're produced in the distant universe by some process we still don't fully understand, and they arrive here as ultra-high-energy cosmic rays. Protons mostly, hurled out of some cosmic source with energies millions of times greater than anything we can produce on Earth. When these particles hit the atmosphere, they leave traces. We can measure them. And if you collect enough of them, you can ask whether they seem to be coming from all directions equally, as they should in a rotationally symmetrical universe, or whether there's a subtle preference for certain directions, the kind of preference that would suggest an underlying grid. Bean, Davudi, and Savage looked at what the existing cosmic ray data said. They considered a well-known phenomenon called the Greisen-Zatzepin-Kuzmin cutoff, a limit predicted in the 1960s and observed since on how much energy a cosmic ray can have before it starts to interact with the cosmic microwave background and lose speed. The cutoff sits at around 50 exelectron volts, which, for anyone who likes their numbers with a physical sense attached to them, is roughly the kinetic energy of a tennis ball concentrated into a single proton. Enough to make your scale of energies go blurry. And the question Bean and his colleagues asked was, at these energies, does the cosmic ray spectrum show any signs of the rotational symmetry breaking a lattice simulation would predict? The answer, when they looked, was no. I want to say this carefully because it is where the paper is most often misreported in popular science writing. The authors did not prove that we are not in a simulation. They did not even prove that we are not in a lattice simulation. What they showed was something more modest and in some ways more interesting. They showed that if we are in a lattice simulation and if that lattice has a particular set of features, the features you would expect from a fairly straightforward extrapolation of the kinds of simulations current physics knows how to do, then the lattice must be finer than a certain scale, and the signatures we might expect to see are not currently visible in the cosmic ray data we have. They placed a lower bound on the simulation's fineness, if it exists. They did not rule out the simulation itself, which might sound like a small result. In one sense it is, in another sense it is not, because the paper did something that had not been done before. It took the simulation hypothesis out of the seminar room and placed it, however provisionally, in the lab. For the first time, there was an empirical question attached to the philosophy. You could, in principle, look for evidence. You might not find it, they didn't. But the hypothesis was no longer purely abstract. It had grown a testable edge, even if the testing would need to wait for better data. Not everyone was happy about this. The sharpest objection came, a few years later, from the theoretical physicist Sabine Hossenfelder, who wrote and lectured at some length about why, in her view, the whole simulation hypothesis should be classified as pseudoscience. Her argument is not that the Bean paper was bad. As physics, she has no particular quarrel with it. Her argument is that the simulation hypothesis as a general claim is immune to falsification in a way that matters. Any test you design, Hossenfelder points out, can be evaded. If you don't find lattice artifacts, the believer says the simulators are using a finer lattice. If you don't find any artifacts at all, the believer says the simulators have constructed the simulation without such features. If you find strange anomalies in physics, the believer says those are glitches. If you don't, the believer says the simulation is well written. No observation can rule out the hypothesis because the hypothesis can flex around any observation, and a claim that cannot, in principle, be ruled out, Hossenfelder argues, following a long tradition going back to Karl Popper, is not a scientific claim at all. It's a metaphysical one dressed in scientific clothing. This is a serious objection, and not everyone in the physics community agrees with it. Some physicists, the computer scientist Scott Aronson among them, argue that Hossenfelder is too quick. A hypothesis can be hard to test without being pseudoscientific, they say, if it is the kind of hypothesis that might eventually, with different tools or different data, become testable. The Bean paper itself is a partial counterexample to Hossenfelder's strong claim. It found a way to put at least one narrow version of the simulation hypothesis into contact with evidence. That contact produced no positive signal, but it didn't have to in order to count as science. Science also makes progress by ruling things out. Both of these responses are legitimate, and the right answer, I think, sits between them in a way that doesn't flatter either side. The simulation hypothesis is not, as Hossenfelder suggests, completely untestable. The Bean work shows that at least some versions of it have empirical consequences, but it is also not, as enthusiasts sometimes imply, a well-posed scientific hypothesis waiting for its data. It is, right now, a very thin set of testable claims surrounded by a much larger set of claims that cannot be tested at all, or that can be tested only under assumptions so specific they amount to asking a different question. The testable core is real. The untestable surround is real. A careful person holds both at once, which leaves us where Bean, Davudi, and Savage left us in 2012. They looked. They found nothing that supported the hypothesis, which means one of two things. Either the hypothesis is wrong, the universe is not being computed on a lattice with the kind of features they were looking for, or the hypothesis is right, but the lattice is finer than anything we can currently probe, and the evidence, if there is any, is beyond our reach. Neither of these results is satisfying. Both of them are honest. The physics has given us what physics can give us, and what physics can give us, when the question is this large, turns out to be a limit. Not a limit on the universe, but a limit on what we can know from where we stand. If you are lying there, noticing that your body has been still for a while now and the room has taken on the particular quality it has around this hour, you might want to let the paper sit with you for a moment, not the technical details, the shape of it. 3 physicists in a building in Seattle looked for a signature of the most ambitious skeptical hypothesis in philosophy, and the signature was not there, or it was there, but too small to see. The hypothesis, in its testable version, is still alive. In its untestable version, it will probably always be alive. Somewhere between the two, there is an honest place for a person to stand, and as it happens, the difficulty of knowing where exactly to stand, the question of whether we should even be looking for the answer, or whether the looking itself might be dangerous, is the question a philosopher in Singapore was going to raise a few years after Bean's paper, in an argument that most people, when they first hear it, assume must be a joke. It isn't a joke. It is, if anything, the most uncomfortable objection anyone has made to the whole enterprise of trying to answer this question at all. Imagine someone hands you a small, sealed box. The box, they tell you, contains the answer to the question you have been sitting with for the last 2 hours. Open it, and you'll know with certainty whether the world you're in is a simulation. They hand it to you without ceremony. It's yours. You can open it whenever you like. You can also, if you prefer, never open it. They add one detail, almost as an afterthought. There's a small chance, they don't know exactly how small, that opening the box will cause the world to end. Not your world, the world, everything, your life, the lives of everyone you love, every person who has ever been kind to you, every project you have ever cared about, all of it, gone. In the moment, you learn the answer. They don't know the probability. It might be very low, it might not be. What do you do? Most people, when they first hear this, say they wouldn't open the box. Then a second later, they feel embarrassed because they realize how thin the reasoning is. You don't know the probability of destruction. Maybe it's 1 in a trillion. Maybe it's 1 in 5. Without that number, how can you decide? And yet the initial instinct stands quietly in the middle of the embarrassment. Something in you says, don't open the box. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The cost of being wrong is too large, and the benefit of being right is too small. This is, in a slightly more technical form, the argument that a philosopher named Preston Green published in the journal Erkenntnis in 2018, with print publication following in 2020. Green teaches at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is a careful philosopher, not a sensationalist, and the paper, which is called The Termination Risks of Simulation Science, is written with the dryness of someone who knows his argument is going to be misread and is trying to forestall the easier misreadings. The argument is not that we shouldn't think about whether we're in a simulation. The argument is that, under certain plausible assumptions, we shouldn't try to find out. Here is the reasoning. If a more advanced civilization is running ancestor simulations of its own past, they are probably doing so, Green argues, for research. The whole point of building a historical simulation is to test counterfactuals. What would have happened if the climate conference in 2015 had gone differently? What would the economic crisis of 2032 have produced if such and such policy had been pursued? How does a population respond to this or that crisis? The simulation is a laboratory. Its value to the people running it depends on its being a reasonable proxy for the world whose past they are trying to understand. Now imagine that somewhere inside this simulated world, the inhabitants develop the capacity to detect that they are inside it. They announce it. The news spreads. Within a few years, most of the population has incorporated the fact of being simulated into their daily thinking. Decisions get made differently, the economy responds, religious movements shift, whole new kinds of art and politics appear. From the point of view of the simulators who were running the simulation to learn about their own non-simulated past, something has now gone very wrong. The simulation has ceased to be a reasonable proxy. The inhabitants are no longer behaving the way they would in a real historical scenario because they know something no one in the real scenario knew. The research value of the simulation has collapsed. The simulation is no longer informative. What do the simulators do next? Green's answer, and the answer is not a prediction, just an articulation of what seems rational from the simulator's side, is that they shut it down, they turn it off, they delete the run. Not out of cruelty, out of lab hygiene. A contaminated experiment is not useful, and the storage and processing costs of a failed simulation are, for any remotely realistic computing architecture, not trivial. The rational move is to terminate, which means, from our side, that if we are in an ancestor simulation, any serious attempt to verify that we are in one, any test whose success would be published, broadcast, and absorbed into the culture, carries with it a small but non-trivial risk that it would trigger our own deletion. Green does not claim the risk is high. He doesn't know because none of us knows. What he claims is that the risk is not zero, and that for a risk of terminal collective destruction, zero is the only acceptable level. His exact phrasing is careful. Unless the probability of destruction is vanishingly small, which we have no basis for asserting, it is not rational to run the experiment. I want to be honest about my first reaction to this argument because I think it's worth tracing. When I first encountered Green's paper, I thought it was a clever provocation, a little bit of analytic philosophy dressed up to make a headline, the kind of thing that shows up in the New York Times, as Green's own summary of the argument indeed did in August of 2019. Under the title, "Are We Living in a Computer Simulation? Let's Not Find Out." I read the piece, was mildly entertained, and moved on. Then, some months later, for reasons that had nothing to do with Green, I was thinking about a different question: the ethics of certain kinds of scientific research, whether we should always pursue a testable hypothesis just because it is testable. And I realized a little uncomfortably that my dismissal of Green had not been an argument, it had been an instinct. The instinct was that you should always try to know what you can try to know, and that declining to investigate is a kind of cowardice or superstition. When I looked at that instinct directly, I noticed that it was not obviously right. Some investigations had, historically, not been worth what they cost. Some investigations had produced knowledge so dangerous that the people who produced it came to regret their work. My dismissal of Green was the sound of someone protecting an instinct that they had never examined. I don't think Green is necessarily right. I think he has raised a possibility that the simulation community had not previously reckoned with, and that the possibility deserves better than a dismissal. Other philosophers have taken up the challenge in more detail. The most sustained response came from two Australian philosophers, David Braddon Mitchell and Andrew Latham, in a 2024 paper also published in Erkenntnis titled Ancestor Simulations and the Dangers of Simulation Probes. Their response is not that Green is wrong exactly. It's that Green's argument depends on a specific set of assumptions about what the simulators care about, and that if you vary those assumptions even slightly, the risk evaporates. Their reasoning has several layers, but the central move is this. Green assumes that simulators want to simulate uncontaminated worlds, worlds whose inhabitants haven't discovered they're simulated. Braddon Mitchell and Latham point out that this is only one possibility. Simulators might equally be interested in simulating what happens when a civilization does make the discovery. That might, in fact, be one of the most interesting research questions you could ask from the simulator's position. Does the civilization collapse, become more ethical, more reckless, discover religion, or lose it? If the simulators are curious about any of this, then our discovery is not contamination. It's exactly what they were trying to study. Which means the critics argue that we cannot infer from the mere fact of being in a simulation that our discovery would trigger termination. The inference depends on a very particular model of what the simulators want, and the space of possible simulator goals is larger than that model acknowledges. I find this response persuasive as far as it goes. But the deeper point of Green's paper, the point that survives after the technical argument has been pulled at, isn't a probability calculation. It's a stance about how to handle uncertainty when the downside is total. When what is at stake is everything we are, the ordinary rules for weighing risks may not apply. This is the structure of what philosophers sometimes call the precautionary principle, and defenders and critics have been arguing about it for most of a century. Green is applying it to the simulation question. What I notice is that most of us carry, almost without examining it, the opposite commitment. The idea that knowing is better than not knowing, that a testable claim ought to be tested, that progress means finding out. Green doesn't defeat that commitment, but he does force us to see that it is a commitment, not an obvious truth. There are possible conditions, strange but not impossible, under which knowing would be worse than not knowing. Most of us do not carry this possibility in our heads. Green is asking us to put it there. The question we started with tonight was, are we living in a simulation? Green's essay quietly does something to that question that nothing else we've looked at has done. It suggests that the question might be one we shouldn't answer, even if we could. Not because the answer would be bad, but because the asking might be. That's a stranger position than it first appears. And it is part of what makes the simulation hypothesis unique among the great skeptical scenarios of philosophy. No one ever worried that finding out the external world was real or unreal would, in itself, do anything. With this hypothesis, the finding out has, at least possibly, consequences. The question has teeth. If you are lying there, letting that sit, something subtler is worth noticing. The argument Green makes is abstract. It's about a hypothetical discovery and a hypothetical termination, in a situation whose probability we can't assess. But the general shape, a question whose asking might cost more than its answer is worth, is not abstract at all. Most lives contain at least one of these. A conversation you could have with a parent, if you chose to. A truth you could pursue about a relationship, if you chose to. A diagnostic test you could undergo if you chose to. The structure of do I want to know versus can I bear to know is, in much smaller forms, ordinary. Green's contribution is to point out that the simulation question belongs, strangely, to this family. It is not purely academic. It touches, however distantly, the part of you that has already had to make some version of this decision about something closer to home. Which is one way the simulation question has started to show up in places the simulation hypothesis never expected, in people's actual experience, in the texture of their days, in the way some people, without any theoretical apparatus at all, have begun to feel that something about the world is not quite where they left it. There is a feeling that quite a lot of people know, though most of them do not have a name for it. You are doing something ordinary, walking down a street, standing in a supermarket, sitting across from someone you've known for years, and for a few seconds, or sometimes much longer, the world goes a little wrong. Not visually. You can still see everything. You can describe the objects. You can name the person you're with. But the quality of it has thinned out. The scene feels, somehow, as if it were painted on a surface rather than being the thing itself. Colors are muted or too bright. Sound arrives with a slight delay. Your hand looks like your hand, but not quite. A glass wall has come down between you and everything else, and you cannot tell if it was there all along and you'd stopped noticing it, or whether it has just now arrived. In psychiatry, this experience has a name. The name is derealization, and in its chronic form it is classified, together with a related experience called depersonalization, the same feeling directed at yourself rather than the world, as a disorder, usually abbreviated DPDR. The disorder, in its serious form, is disabling. People who live with it describe years of their lives in which nothing has felt real, during which they have continued to function, to go to work, to raise children, to attend funerals, while some inner dial of reality has simply not been registering. Transient episodes of the same experience, lasting minutes or hours, are much more common. Many people have had them without realizing that there is a clinical category for what they were going through. Psychedelics can produce them. Exhaustion can. High anxiety can. So can, for some people, ordinary stretches of life for no obvious reason at all. I want to bring this experience into the conversation carefully because there is a risk in what we're about to do. A philosophical discussion of simulation hypotheses can easily turn derealization, which is for many people a source of real suffering, into a piece of useful intellectual material, a natural experiment, a data point, a vivid illustration for a thesis. That framing has costs, and not everyone who lives with the disorder welcomes the philosophical gaze falling on it. What follows is an attempt to honor both sides. The fact that the experience is, philosophically, genuinely interesting, and the fact that the people who have it are not philosophers, raw material. The experience matters here because it sits, in a strange way, at the center of the evening's question. People with derealization are, in one clear sense, making exactly the observation that philosophers from Plato onward have been asking us to take seriously. They are reporting that the world, right now, does not feel real to them. Not the world of some other possible scenario. This world. The chair. The window. The person they love. The hand at the end of their arm. All of it. Unreliable. Thin. Somehow not quite the thing it purports to be. If you were to take everything Plato and Descartes and Bostrom and Chalmers have said about the possibility that the apparent world is not the real one and compress it into a single lived sensation, the result would be very close to what a person with derealization describes. And this is where two distinct philosophical responses diverge. The first response, argued carefully by the French philosopher Alexandre Baillet in a paper published in Metaphilosophy in early 2024, is that the coincidence is not what it looks like. Baillet works at the University of Lille and has spent years writing on depersonalization, derealization, and what they might tell us about the structure of ordinary experience. His paper is titled approximately The Psychopathology of Metaphysics, and it reverses the direction most philosophical writing on this subject assumes. Philosophers, Baillet argues, have tended to read the testimony of derealization patients as a glimpse into something the rest of us are missing, as if the patients had, through some accident of illness, been given a sight of the unreality the philosophers have long suspected. Baillet thinks this is exactly backwards. The patients, he argues, are not seeing something true that the rest of us cannot see. They are experiencing a disorder of a particular feeling, what Baillet calls the sense of existence. And the absence of that feeling in them tells us something about the rest of us, namely, that for almost all of us, almost all of the time, the feeling is present. That the ordinary sense that the world is real is not a philosophical assumption we have to argue for. It is a primary feature of healthy experience, of which derealization is the disease. If Baillet is right, the move is clean. The simulation hypothesis, along with structuralism and other philosophical doctrines that try to argue from the gap between science and experience to the claim that the world isn't really what it seems, is not supported by the testimony of derealization. It's undermined by it. The patients, far from seeing something we can't see, are failing to feel something we do feel. The intuition of unreality on which the whole skeptical tradition rests is not a signal from deeper truth. It's a dysfunction of the sense of existence, temporarily or chronically offline in some people, fully functional in most. This is a serious argument, and Baillet defends it with care. It also lands at an uncomfortable place, which the American science writer John Horgan, in a blog post responding to Baillet's paper in the spring of 2024, put his finger on directly. Horgan is interesting in this context because he has lived on and off with derealization since childhood. He knows what Baillet is describing from the inside, and his response to Baillet's argument is not a philosophical refutation. It's a kind of doubled testimony, an acknowledgement that he would like Baillet to be right because Baillet's framing would make the experience merely a malfunction, something a psychiatrist might treat. Nothing more. But he also notices that he isn't sure Baillet is right. He recalls episodes of derealization. One after a drug trip in 1981 had been particularly durable, in which the impression was not that his reality meter was broken, but that he was, briefly, seeing more clearly than usual, that what had been stripped away was not the sense of reality, but the ordinary habit of not noticing its strangeness. Horgan does not claim this is what was happening. He claims he cannot quite tell, and that the uncertainty, for him, has not been resolved by philosophical argument. There is a third voice worth bringing in because she speaks from the place both Baillet and Horgan are trying to describe from outside. One of Horgan's former students, identified in his writing only as Camille, has lived with derealization since childhood and has made a film about it. Her description of the condition is plain. It feels, she says, as if there were a glass wall between her and everything else. She has interviewed other people with the condition. Their testimonies are similar. The descriptions converge across many people on the same cluster of metaphors: a film, a simulation, a dream one is unable to wake from, a pane of glass. Whatever derealization is, it produces, consistently, the sensation of being on the wrong side of something. And it produces, for many of the people who have it, a kind of enforced amateur philosophy, a set of questions about reality that they cannot help but keep asking because the questions have become inseparable from their daily lives. One patient, quoted in Baillet's own paper, puts it this way: for them, the question of whether the world is real is not a fun theory to think about. It is a question they have to tell themselves repeatedly not to pursue. So what are we looking at? Baillet says, a disease that philosophers have mistaken for insight. Horgan says, maybe, but I'm not sure, because I've been inside it and I don't know. Camille and the others say, in effect, whatever you decide philosophically, this is my life. I will be living with this tomorrow morning whether or not you have figured out the metaphysics. I don't think the debate gets cleanly resolved. I'm not sure it can be. Baillet's framing has the advantage of treating the condition as a disorder that might be alleviated, which is what patients often want. Horgan's uncertainty has the advantage of not overriding the patient's own reports, which sometimes include the report that something real, however uncomfortable, is being perceived. The two framings look incompatible on the surface. They may not be entirely. What is worth noticing is that both can be true at once. It can be that derealization is, clinically, a disorder, something produced by particular neural mechanisms, something that can sometimes be treated, something whose presence is consistent with no deeper truth about the world. And it can also be that the experience derealization produces is, accidentally, continuous with some of the oldest philosophical intuitions humans have ever had. The experience is not the philosophy, but the experience shows that the philosophy is not coming from nowhere. The feeling of unreality in some people, some of the time, is as real a feature of human consciousness as any other. It shows up in patients. It shows up in philosophers. It shows up in certain contemplative practitioners, and, in passing, in a great many ordinary people who have never thought about it for long enough to name it. And what it is, exactly, is a question we have not yet settled, which leaves you maybe in a slightly different relation to your own ordinary days than you were in an hour ago. If you have ever had a few seconds in which the world thinned out, if you have ever, in a supermarket or a car or a living room, felt the room go briefly unreal, you have been in close contact with something that thousands of people are experiencing as a chronic condition right now, and that philosophers have been circling for 2,500 years. The relation between these three groups, patients, contemplatives, philosophers, is not obvious. They may be looking at different things. They may be looking at the same thing with different lenses. What is not in doubt is that whatever they are looking at, it is not nothing. It is a genuine feature of how some minds, under some conditions, encounter the world. If you are lying there, letting the room be the room again, it might be worth noticing that the ordinariness of this particular moment, the weight of the blanket, the feel of the pillow, the quiet insistence of your own breath, is not nothing either. Whatever is underneath it, and however philosophers sort out whether it is a simulation or not a simulation or a question badly posed, the sense that it is here and you are in it, and the contact between you and it is real, is a feature of being a healthy mind. Derealization patients would, many of them, give a great deal to have that sense back. It's worth noticing you have it. There is one more question the simulation debate has not yet confronted squarely. It is the one that sits underneath all the others. It is the question of whether the kind of thing you are, a conscious mind, is the kind of thing that can be simulated at all, because the whole argument, from Bostrom through Chalmers, has been assuming that it is. If it isn't, the hypothesis doesn't so much get refuted as get silently withdrawn, and the assumption is not as secure as it looks. Is the kind of thing you are right now the kind of thing that can be simulated? Set aside, for a moment, whether a simulation of you would count as you. That's a different question, and philosophers have been arguing about it since at least the 1960s, when they invented the term personal identity to describe what they were arguing about. The question here is prior. The question is whether a simulation could produce in its simulated person whatever it is that makes you right now, this particular listener, lying or sitting where you are in whatever light there is, a subject who is having an experience. Whether consciousness, in other words, is the kind of thing you can make on a sufficiently powerful computer, or whether it is the kind of thing that requires some very specific material circumstances to exist at all. This is the assumption the whole simulation argument from Bostrom through Chalmers has been quietly resting on. It's called substrate independence, and we met the term earlier in the evening. The idea is that consciousness is a kind of pattern, a particular way that information flows, a particular structure of computation, and that the pattern can, in principle, be produced in many different physical substrates: neurons, silicon chips, some future computing medium we haven't invented yet. So long as the computation is right, the consciousness will follow. It's like asking whether chess can be played on a wooden board or a digital screen. The answer is both, because chess isn't made of wood. If substrate independence is true, the simulation hypothesis becomes a live possibility. A future civilization with enough computing power could, in principle, run simulations of conscious people, and those simulated people would be conscious. If substrate independence is false, if consciousness is tied in some deep way to the particular physical stuff of biological brains, then the whole argument quietly collapses. You can't simulate what you can't produce. The Bostrom hypothesis, in that case, is not so much refuted as silently withdrawn. And here is where the question gets harder than it first looks, because substrate independence is not a proven claim. It is a position held by a lot of philosophers and most of the people who work professionally on the simulation hypothesis, but it's a position that has serious opponents, and the opponents have not been refuted. One of the most developed opposing views comes from an Italian neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi, working with the German neuroscientist Christoph Koch and a growing community of collaborators in a framework they call Integrated Information Theory, usually abbreviated IIT. Their central claim, stripped down to its core, is that consciousness is not a pattern of computation that can be moved from one substrate to another. Consciousness is a physical feature of certain kinds of causal structures that integrate information in particular ways. A system has consciousness to the degree that it has a quantity they call phi, which measures how much information the system as a whole contains beyond what its parts contain separately. And crucially, phi depends on the actual physical causal connections in the system. It's not enough to compute the same input-output function. You have to be the same kind of physical thing. If IT is right, and it is one of the most empirically active theories of consciousness in the scientific literature, even if it is far from settled, then a simulation of a brain running on a silicon chip is not automatically conscious, even if it produces all the same outputs, because the silicon chip, the computation notwithstanding, has a different causal structure. Its phi is different. It might behave exactly like you. It might say the same things. It might pass every possible behavioral test, but it would be, IIT claims, no one from the inside, a very good philosophical zombie, in a sense, empty of experience, no matter how convincing the outputs. This is not a fringe view. It has serious scientific and philosophical backing, and it's in direct tension with the substrate independence that the whole simulation argument needs in order to run. There's another line of attack on substrate independence coming from a different direction entirely, and it's worth bringing in because it catches the simulation hypothesis from an angle most discussions miss. In 2022, a Canadian philosopher of science named Paul Thagard, who teaches at the University of Waterloo, published a paper in Philosophy of Science with a title that makes the argument in advance: Energy Requirements Undermine Substrate Independence and Mind-Body Functionalism. Thagard's objection is physical rather than structural. His point is that real-world information processing always costs energy, and the energy a system can use depends on the physical substrate it's made of. Brains run on glucose. They're extraordinarily energy efficient for what they do. The human brain consumes about 20 watts, roughly the power of a dim light bulb, while performing cognitive tasks no computer can yet match. A silicon chip simulating the same work consumes at current technology several orders of magnitude more energy, which might sound like a minor practical problem. Thagard argues that it isn't, because, he says, the energy constraints shape what the system can actually do, and the fact that brains can do certain things with certain energy budgets is itself a deep fact about what brains are. Take the glucose away and you lose the mechanism that does the work. Try to reproduce the work on a different energy budget, and different kinds of computation become feasible, while other kinds become impossible. Thagard's conclusion is striking. Substrate independence, on his view, is an abstraction that breaks down as soon as you look at the actual physics. Minds are not free-floating programs that can be moved from one implementation to another. Minds are particular physical processes that exist because certain kinds of stuff with certain kinds of energy happen to be around. Change the stuff, change the energy, and you don't get the same mind somewhere else. You get something different, maybe something impressive, maybe even something intelligent, but not the same kind of inner thing. Against all of this, David Chalmers has been a patient and detailed defender of substrate independence, and in 2023, he published a paper on the specific question of whether current large language models, the AI systems many of us have by now spent time with, might be conscious, or whether their near descendants might be. His answer is characteristically careful. He thinks current models are probably not conscious, but he does not rule out that the next generation might be, and he thinks the question deserves serious philosophical attention rather than casual dismissal. His reasoning, very briefly, is that if substrate independence is true, there's no principled reason to draw the line at biological brains. Something with the right kind of computational structure, in principle, gets in. Whether a large language model has that kind of structure is an open question, but the fact that it's open, for Chalmers, is already a significant concession. I have to say something honest here. I have read a good deal of the literature on this, and I do not know the answer. Nobody does. Consciousness is the thing we are most directly acquainted with. It is, for each of us, the only thing we have unmediated access to. And it is also the thing we have the least idea how to explain. The neuroscience is young. The philosophical frameworks contradict each other. The empirical tests we have, tests for whether something is conscious, are reliable only for being similar enough to us that we can extrapolate from our own case, and they break down completely when applied to anything genuinely different. Whether a large language model is conscious, whether a silicon-based simulation of a brain would be conscious, whether a pattern of computation abstracted from any particular physical substrate could be conscious at all. These are questions for which no scientific consensus exists. No philosophical consensus exists, and honest experts disagree. This is not because they haven't thought hard enough. It is because the problem is genuinely at the edge of what anyone at this point in history knows how to approach. What that means for the simulation hypothesis is that its foundation is not as solid as it is usually presented. Bostrom's argument, Chalmers' argument, the whole edifice built up over 20-some years, depends on a specific answer to a question that has not been answered. If substrate independence turns out to be false, if consciousness is tied to biological substrates, or to particular energy budgets, or to causal structures that can't be abstracted from their physical implementation, then the simulation hypothesis, in its strong form, is not a live possibility. It becomes instead a category error, the mistake of treating something as reproducible that isn't. This is not a refutation of the simulation argument, it's a description of where the argument actually stands. The argument works if substrate independence is true. It doesn't work if substrate independence is false. And whether substrate independence is true is not something we know. We have good theorists on both sides, careful experiments that partially inform the debate, and a general sense across the community of people who study this for a living that the question will probably not be settled in our lifetimes, which places you, listening to this, in an unusual position. You have been following, for the last 2 hours, an argument whose central move depends on a premise that is unproven. The premise might be true. If it is, the argument is alive and worth taking seriously, and you should do whatever sitting with it your temperament permits. The premise might be false. If it is, the argument evaporates, and the whole evening has been, in one sense, an elaborate exploration of a hypothesis whose foundation was always uncertain. In another sense, though, nothing would be wasted. Because the exploration has not only been about the simulation hypothesis, it has been about the questions that cluster around it, about what real means, about what mind is, about what kind of knowing is possible from inside a mind that is trying to understand itself. Those questions survive any answer to the substrate question. They were there long before Bostrom wrote his paper, and they will be there long after the question of simulation in its current form has either been answered or has been quietly replaced by a different question we don't yet have the vocabulary for. What you are, lying there in the dark, whatever that turns out to be, is still a thing whose nature hasn't been pinned down. The scientists don't know. The philosophers don't know. The contemplatives know something, but what they know is hard to put into the kind of sentences that satisfy the scientists and the philosophers. The only thing that is certain, in a plain and unphilosophical way, is that there is something having this experience right now, and the something is you. What kind of thing the something is, a pattern that could be moved, a physical process that couldn't, a structure whose features we haven't yet learned to name, is the question underneath every other question we've asked tonight. And it is the question at which honesty for anyone runs out of good things to say. If the answer is never quite found, something else might still be worth asking. Not what are we, but what would it change if we knew? What difference would a settled answer to any of this make tomorrow morning when you wake up in whatever body you have and go about your day? That question sounds at first rhetorical. It isn't. It is one of the oldest and quietest questions in ethics, and it turns out to be a good question to sit with as the hour gets late. Here is something odd about the simulation question, and the oddness is worth noticing before we do anything else with it. Suppose the answer arrived tomorrow at breakfast, a press conference, a peer-reviewed paper, some combination of evidence and argument that settled the matter, one way or the other, beyond reasonable dispute. We are in a simulation, or we are not. The sentence appears in the news, and you read it with your coffee. Now ask yourself, honestly, by lunchtime, how different is your day? Most people, when they sit with this, notice something they find hard to admit. The day wouldn't be very different. You'd still have whatever appointments you had. You'd still owe whatever emails you owed. The people you love would still be the people you love. The food in the fridge would still be the food in the fridge. A few minutes, maybe an afternoon of altered mood, and then a gradual return to the shape of life as you had it. This is not because the news wouldn't be significant. It would be, but significance, it turns out, is a surprisingly narrow window in a human life, and most of what we do is not done under that window. Most of what we do is done under ordinary conditions, for ordinary reasons, with ordinary company. Philosophers have worried about this observation for a long time, in various forms. The most famous version belongs to Robert Nozick, an American philosopher who in 1974 published a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. The book is mostly about political theory, but buried inside it is a thought experiment that has probably been taught to more undergraduates than any other 20th century idea in moral philosophy. Nozick asks, suppose there were a machine that could give you any experience you wanted. Researchers could design, moment by moment, the most vivid possible version of whatever life you'd choose. Perfect relationships, meaningful work, adventure, peace, love. All of it felt exactly the way the real thing would feel because the machine was wired into your brain and producing the feelings directly. Once you entered, you would forget you were in the machine. The illusion would be complete. Would you plug in? Nozick thought most people wouldn't, and he thought the reluctance told us something important, that what human beings actually want is not just experience, but contact with something outside experience. We want to do things, not just feel like we've done them. We want to be certain kinds of people, not just feel like we are. We want the world we act in to be actually there, and the people we love to be actually loving us back, not fed to us by a machine. The thought experiment, Nozick argued, is a kind of test for what we value, and the test shows that mere experience is not enough. Reality matters, and it matters in a way the simulation hypothesis, if true, would trouble. That's one way to answer the what would change question. It says, something large would change because the world you thought you were in turns out not to be there. The loved ones turn out to be rendered. The work turns out to be pretend. A kind of grief is appropriate, Nozick's view suggests, at the discovery. There is another tradition, much older, that takes the question in a very different direction. The Stoic philosophers of the ancient world, Epictetus writing in the 1st century, Marcus Aurelius writing in the 2nd, Seneca writing a little earlier, all made, in their various ways, a distinction that has weathered better than most ancient ideas. Some things, they said, are within your control, and most things are not. Your own judgments, your own choices, the direction of your attention, the quality of your character, these are yours. Almost everything else, what happens to you, how others treat you, the state of the world, whether the world turns out to be one thing or another, is not. Epictetus put it bluntly. It is not the things that trouble people, but their judgments about the things. A person who has worked through the distinction and lives by it becomes, by degrees, less shaken by circumstance. Not because circumstance doesn't matter, but because the part of circumstance that they can do anything about is much smaller than they once thought, and giving their energy to the rest is a waste. If a Stoic were handed the news at breakfast, we are in a simulation, they would, I think, notice the news, consider for a moment whether it changed anything they could do about their day, conclude that it didn't, and continue with their work. Not out of indifference, but out of discipline. Simulated or not, the job of the morning is to live well in the life one has. The substrate of that life is above one's pay grade. The conduct within it is not. A third tradition, closer to us, offers a variant of the Stoic response, but in different language. The American philosopher William James, writing at the end of the 19th century, proposed something he called the pragmatic method. If two hypotheses make no practical difference, if everything you would do, everything you would feel, everything you would decide is the same whether one or the other is true, then the dispute between them, James thought, is less important than it first appears. Not meaningless, not trivial, but not where the real weight of life sits. The simulation hypothesis, by James's test, is, if not empty, at least surprisingly light. Whether we are in a simulation or not, the lived texture of life is what we actually have, and it is identical in both cases. I want to be careful here, because the move I'm tracing is easy to misread. I am not saying the simulation question doesn't matter. I think it does matter, philosophically, spiritually, in the way deep metaphysical questions have always mattered to the people who keep them company. What the Nozick thought experiment and the Stoic tradition and James's pragmatism all point at in their different ways is that the mattering is not the same as the action guiding. Some questions matter precisely because they are not actionable. Some questions shape how we attend to things without telling us what to do differently. The simulation question may be one of these. You can carry it and be changed by the carrying without the carrying telling you on any given morning to do one thing rather than another. This is a strange position to end up in after the 2 hours we've had. We've moved through Plato's cave, Descartes' demon, Bostrom's trilemma, Chalmers' realism, Shankara's 2 registers, Vasubandhu's mind only, the physics test that found nothing, the ethical argument for not looking, the lived experience of derealization, the deep question of whether minds can be simulated at all, a great deal of conceptual terrain. And the honest answer about what we'd do with a resolution to any of it, how our lives would actually change, turns out to be, for most people, not very much, which, when you sit with it for a while, is not a disappointment. It's a piece of information about what a life is. The life is not an answer to a question. It's a place where the questions get asked and kept. The answers, when they come at all, are usually smaller than the questions that produced them. And the shape of the life, how it feels to be living in it, what it's like to pay attention inside it, what you do when someone asks you how you are, is set mostly by things that would survive almost any metaphysical revelation. The love you have for the people you love would survive the news. The work you find meaningful would survive it. The kindness you have tried to cultivate or not cultivated would be where it already is. The simulation, if there is one, does not reach down into these things, and that is an interesting fact about them. The question we started with was, are we living in a simulation? Somewhere in the last hour it became, what would we do if we knew? And now, gently, it has become something else again. Not what would change, but what already doesn't. What has already, across a long human history, been impervious to the biggest answers any tradition has given? What has continued to be what it is, regardless? That, too, is worth carrying into the dark. In 2019, Nick Bostrom sat down for a long conversation with the podcaster Joe Rogan. They talked about a lot of things: existential risk, artificial intelligence, the future of human civilization. And toward the end, Rogan asked the question that had by then been following Bostrom around for nearly 20 years. Do you think we are in a simulation? Bostrom's answer, delivered in the quiet and slightly hesitant way he has, was that he gives the hypothesis about a 20% probability, maybe a little less, not higher. He has given the same answer, with minor variations, in every public conversation where he has been asked. This is worth sitting with, because the public image of Bostrom's argument is not 20%. The public image is that Bostrom believes we are almost certainly simulated. The billionaire quotes, the popular articles, the documentary talking points, they all trend toward high confidence. The man who wrote the paper, the person whose credence ought to count for more than anyone else's, holds a position much quieter than the one that has been attributed to him. He thinks one of three possibilities must be true, and he has never been willing to say which he finds most likely. The argument in his own mouth sounds different from the argument in its cultural afterlife. What makes this interesting is not the gossip value, it's the shape of the relationship Bostrom has developed to his own question over the 2 decades since he first posed it. Here is a person who has spent 20 years thinking, professionally and personally, about whether he and everyone he knows might be inside a simulation. In that time, his views have not hardened into a confident position. They have not dissolved into dismissal. They have settled instead into a kind of steady, careful, uncertain attention. He carries the question. He does not answer it. And the way he does this is, in itself, an education in what it looks like to live with a serious philosophical question over a long time. This is not a new skill. Most of the traditions we've touched on tonight have a version of it. Zhuangzi, when he wrote down his story about the butterfly, did not explain what it meant. He wrote it down and walked away. When his readers, across 24 centuries, have tried to pin the meaning, they have found that the text resists them. Each generation of readers finds their own resonance, and the text stays slightly bigger than any particular reading. Zhuangzi, in the few biographical fragments we have, seems to have lived this way himself. He refused high office. He made jokes about death on his own deathbed. He practiced the question of transformation by not holding it too tightly, and his influence on Chinese thought is, as much as anything, an influence of posture, of how to stand in front of a question whose answer will not come. Shankara did something similar, though with different vocabulary. Advaita Vedanta does not tell you to believe that the world is unreal. It tells you to sit with the distinction between the two levels of reality until the sitting changes you. This takes time. It takes a lot of time. The tradition is full of stories about students who spent 30 years with a teacher and, at the end of those 30 years, had not arrived at a doctrine so much as at a different way of being in the world. The question, what is the nature of reality, was not answered. It was carried, and the carrying made them into the people they became. More recently, a small community of contemplative thinkers has started to bring these traditions into direct conversation with the questions modern philosophy and neuroscience are asking. Evan Thompson, a Canadian philosopher of mind who has spent years working at the intersection of Western cognitive science and Asian contemplative thought, argues in his book Waking, Dreaming, Being that the investigation of consciousness cannot be done from the outside alone. It has to be combined with careful, disciplined attention from the inside, the kind of attention that meditative traditions have been developing for millennia. B. Alan Wallace, an American scholar practitioner who has spent decades studying Tibetan Buddhism and its techniques for investigating awareness, says something parallel. The interesting question for Wallace is not what the mind is in the third person, but what the mind is when it examines itself carefully over a long period without losing its footing. Both of them, in different ways, are saying that some questions about the nature of experience are not the kind of thing you can answer by thinking harder. You have to develop the attention that can stand in front of the question without looking away. This is an unfashionable thing to say in a lot of contemporary contexts because it sounds like a dodge. It sounds like someone who can't answer the question is reframing the question so that the absence of an answer becomes a virtue. And this suspicion is worth taking seriously because it's sometimes right. Some reframings really are dodges, but not all of them, and the test is not hard to apply. A dodge is a reframing that lets you stop paying attention to the hard thing. A genuine reframing is one that lets you pay better attention. The traditions we've been looking at, when they are at their best, do the second thing. They don't relieve the pressure of the question. They let you stand in it longer without becoming brittle, which is what carrying a question well looks like in the end. It does not mean knowing the answer. It does not mean being at peace with not knowing. It means being able to keep the question in your life without either solving it or fleeing it. The solving and the fleeing are the two ordinary responses to a hard question, the two ways most of us make a question stop mattering. The third way is less familiar. It is the way Bostrom, at the level of professional philosophy, has practiced for 20 years. It is the way Zhuangzi, in a different idiom, practiced for most of his life. It is the way Shankara's students practiced, and Wallace's and any patient reader of difficult books practices when the book is doing its work. The question stays open. The person is changed by the openness. If you have followed me this far, there is a chance something small has been happening to you over the last 2 hours. The simulation question, when you first heard it, was probably a closed thing, a hypothesis that was either true or false and had a shape and sat at some distance from you. Now, after all the voices we've listened to, it might be slightly more open. It might feel less like a claim about the world and more like a kind of companion question. One of those problems that doesn't go away, that changes shape as your life changes, that you keep encountering in unexpected places. If something like that has happened, you have, for a few hours, been doing what Bostrom has been doing for 20 years. You have been carrying it. That's a small thing. And it's a large thing. Small because you didn't have to do anything unusual. Just listen and let the voices do what voices of this kind do. Large because most of what a life becomes, over time, is shaped by what it has learned to carry. The people you become close to. The work you find meaningful. The values you end up living by. All of these are, in part, shaped by which questions you let in and which ones you learned to keep without answering. The simulation question is not the largest of these questions. It is not the most pressing, but it is, as it turns out, one of the ones our century is quietly asking, and something about the quality of your attention to it is the same muscle that gets exercised in other contexts for much bigger things. You are lying in your room now, most likely. The lamp, or whatever light there is, has been on for a while. Outside, whatever was happening when we began has quieted, or moved on, or continued without much to say about it. The hour is late enough that the question can sit between us without demanding too much. That's a good place to be. It's also, in a way, where we end up. It is late. It may be very late. Whatever the hour is where you are, it is later than it was when we started, and the room you are in has settled into the particular quality that late rooms have. The light, if any, is low. The sounds from outside, if there are any sounds from outside, are the quiet sounds of a world that has mostly finished its day. Your body has been in roughly the same position for a while, and it has started to feel its own weight in the way bodies do when they are no longer being moved around by daytime purposes. This is the hour when the question we've been sitting with for the last 2.5 hours is, if anything, a little easier to hold than it was when we started. Which is useful because the hour we are in is the last one we have together. And there are a few small things I would like to say before it ends. We have, over the last couple of hours, listened to about a dozen voices. I am going to let them come through very briefly one more time. Not to summarize, because you do not need a summary, but because hearing their shapes together quietly for a moment is worth doing before we let them go. A man called Zhuangzi in ancient China dreamed he was a butterfly, and when he woke, he was not entirely sure which direction the dreaming had gone. He did not resolve the question. He wrote it down and let it stand. Plato described a cave and a fire and a wall and a climb up into the sun and a climb back down. He said the allegory was about education, not about the substrate of reality. It has, nevertheless, survived as a picture of both. The people who have read it for 2,500 years have taken from it what each of their times needed. Descartes, in the winter of 1619, had 3 dreams in a heated room in Germany. And 22 years later, he wrote the strangest book in Western philosophy, in which he doubted everything he could and arrived at the bare fact of himself. The evil demon he invented to help him doubt has outlived the proofs that were supposed to put him to rest. Nick Bostrom, in 2003, did arithmetic with assumptions about the future and handed us a 3-part disjunction. He has never been willing to tell us which of the 3 he finds most likely. He has spent 20 years, as he would put it, with a credence of about 1 in 5. Hilary Putnam, 2 decades earlier, asked what our words refer to and noticed that a brain in a vat cannot, in its own language, report the fact of its own envatment. The observation has not been refuted, it has not been proven. The literature, 45 years on, is still working on it. David Chalmers argued that if we are in a simulation, the simulation is real. The tables are real. The people are real. The substrate is different from what we thought. The life on top of it is the life we always had. Shankara, in the 8th century, distinguished the conventional and the ultimate and taught that the 2 levels of reality are both true in different registers and that holding them at once is the work of a life. Vasubandhu, 4 centuries earlier, argued that the question of what lies behind experience might be less well formed than the question of what experience presents, and that the practice of careful attention to what is there is, perhaps, the only answer available to us. 3 physicists in Seattle, in 2012, looked at cosmic ray data and found no signature of a lattice beneath the world. They did not prove we are not in a simulation. They showed where, if we are, the grid would have to be finer than anything we can currently see. Preston Green suggested that the very act of trying to find out carries a risk, and that we might live more wisely by not pursuing certain kinds of confirmation. The argument has not been refuted. It has not been universally accepted. It sits uncomfortably in the literature. And Alexandre Billon, working with people who live with a disorder called derealization, the chronic experience of the world feeling unreal, has argued that the feeling of unreality the philosophers have made so much of is not an insight. It is, in his view, the failure of a healthy function. The rest of us have something the patients do not, and that something is worth being grateful for. These are the voices. They are not in agreement. They have been asking, as we saw, somewhat different questions, and the disagreements among them are real. But they have been asking, in their different ways, the same kind of question. A question that does not get answered quickly. A question whose work is done, mostly, by the carrying. Now here is the part I have been trying all evening to find a way to say. The question we started with, are we living in a simulation, is a question whose answer, if it ever comes, will probably not be found by people like us in rooms like this. The answer, if it comes at all, will come from somewhere. A physics result we don't yet have, a philosophical argument no one has yet made, an insight from a tradition we haven't learned to hear. It might come tomorrow. It might come in 500 years. It might not come. These are all possibilities, and none of us gets to choose which one is true. But the carrying of the question is something else entirely. The carrying of the question has happened already. It has happened for each of us over the course of an evening, in the particular way each of us has allowed the voices in and resisted them, and found ourselves wondering about them, and returned to our bodies and our rooms and our lives. This carrying is not a second-best version of having the answer. It is its own kind of thing. It has its own texture. It shapes, over time, what kind of person a person becomes in ways that are small and cumulative and very real. Most of what a life adds up to, as far as I can tell, is this kind of shaping. You meet questions, and some of them get answered, and some of them don't, and the ones that don't, the ones that keep coming back, are the ones that do the most quiet work on what you are. The questions about who you should love. The questions about what you should spend your life on. The questions about whether any of it matters and, if it does, in what way. The question of whether the world is what it seems to be. These are not quiz questions. They are not waiting for the right answer so they can go away. They are waiting instead to be carried, and the carrying is how a life gets its shape, which means, if I have done this right, that you are in a slightly different position now than you were when we started. You might not be able to name what is different. It might not be anything you can state as a proposition, but the way you stand in front of the question, the simulation question, or the other questions that live in its neighborhood, might be a little different from the way you stood in front of it 3 hours ago. Not because you learned something you can repeat, because your attention has been, for a while, inside a particular kind of thought, and the attention is how you are changed. That is, as much as anything else, what this hour was for. I want to say one more thing before the hour is finished. The simulation question, in the form it has taken in our century, is strange and new, but the structure of it, the question of what is real, of what counts as real, of how to live in a world whose nature is partly hidden, is old. It is as old as people sitting up at night, noticing that the world has gone quiet and wondering what they are doing here. Every tradition we've looked at, every voice, has some version of this question at its center. We are not the first people to sit with it. We will not be the last. It is one of the questions our species keeps, and each generation has to carry it again in its own language, with its own metaphors, under whatever technology happens to be around, which means you are, tonight, part of a very long line of people. Some of them, 2,000 years ago, were lying where you are lying, in the dark, with the last of a fire going out in a corner of their room. Some of them, 500 years from now, will be lying in whatever kind of room 500 years from now produces, with some form of this question still in their minds. In between, countless others, and for a few minutes, on this particular night, you have been in their company. The question does not need to be answered tonight. It did not need to be answered any of the nights of any of the people who have sat with it before you. It needs only to be kept, to be carried a little further into whatever comes next. You have done a good job of carrying it for the last few hours. You do not have to carry it any more tonight. Let the thought of it settle. The hour is late and the day is done, and whatever was pressing on you when this film began has, for the most part, moved a little further away. You can feel your breath if you pay attention to it. You can feel the weight of the blanket, or the chair, or whatever surface you are on. You are where you are, and you are safe, and the question will be there in the morning, and so will everything else. Let yourself rest now. There is nothing more to think about tonight. The voices have said what they have to say, and the thinking has done what thinking can do at this hour, which is not much. The rest of what happens is not a matter of thinking, it is a matter of letting go. So let go. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let your breathing become the slow, undirected breathing of a person who has finished with the day's business. Whatever you were worried about can wait. Whatever you were wondering about will be there, unchanged, when you wake. The question we have been carrying will be there too. For now, you are allowed to set it down. Good night. Sleep well. The morning will come when it comes, and you will be there to meet it, and the world, whatever kind of world it turns out to be, will be there too.